There are armies that fight for their country. There are armies that fight for an ideal. And then there are armies that fight for a single man, bound to him not by law, not by conscription, not by the ordinary machinery of a state at war, but by something far older and far more dangerous than any of those things. Something that looks, from the outside, almost like devotion. This is the story of one of those armies. It began not on a battlefield, but in a beer hall. Not with a general's order, but with a whisper of personal loyalty in a city that had lost its mind. It grew from a handful of hard men standing close to one figure, shielding him, watching the crowd, reading faces for the first sign of danger. In the 1920s, in the wreckage of a Germany that had been humiliated and hollowed out, that small circle of protectors was nothing more than a political bodyguard. Rough men for rough times. Nobody would have looked at them and seen the future. But the future came anyway. What started as a personal escort detail would become, over the course of roughly 2 decades, one of the most heavily documented, most fiercely debated, and most operationally significant fighting formations of the entire Second World War. The unit would carry its founding figure's name on its collar. It would fight on more fronts than most divisions ever saw. It would be present at some of the defining turning points of the conflict, from the forests of Poland to the frozen approaches of the Soviet Union, from the bocage fields of Normandy to the final, collapsing perimeter of a dying Reich. And it would carry with it, through every campaign, the extraordinary weight of what it represented. Not just a military force, but a symbol, a statement, an embodiment, in uniform and steel, of the ideology that had dragged the world into the worst war in human history. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, the name alone carries weight that most people feel before they fully understand it. Leibstandarte, a German compound that translates, roughly, as the bodyguard regiment, and that origin, that insistence on personal protection, on absolute fidelity to one man above all others, never really left the unit, no matter how large it grew or how far it traveled from its beginnings. Even when it was a full armored division fielding tanks and artillery across hundreds of kilometers of front, there was something in its identity that remained stubbornly rooted in that original promise. We are his. Before we are soldiers, we are his. That combination, elite military capability, fused with ideological fanaticism, made the Leibstandarte genuinely formidable in combat. It also made it genuinely dangerous in ways that went beyond the battlefield. The atrocities committed by this formation, and by the broader SS structure it belonged to, are documented, undeniable, and must be part of any honest telling of its history. This is not a story of heroes. It is not a celebration. It is something harder and more necessary than either of those things. It is a full accounting of how a bodyguard became an army, of how that army fought and where it went wrong and what was done in its name, of what happens when loyalty is stripped of conscience and given a weapon. That is the story we are going to tell tonight, all of it, from the beginning. We will start in the chaos of the Weimar years, when Germany was still trying to understand what it had become after the First World War, and when certain men decided that the answer to that uncertainty was not patience or politics, but power, raw, personal, embodied power, concentrated around one voice. We will watch the Leibstandarte take shape under the command of a man named Sepp Dietrich, who would turn street muscle into something resembling a military unit, and who would push that unit through the political violence of the early 1930s into something recognizable as a fighting force. We will follow them through the night of the long knives, a moment that would mark the unit forever. binding it to Hitler through the shared weight of what had been done. We will watch them march into Austria and then into the Sudetenland, arriving not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as instruments of a political ambition that was rapidly outgrowing the constraints of diplomacy. And then the war will start, and everything will change. Poland in September of 1939. France in May of 1940. The vast, terrifying opening of Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, when the Leibstandarte crossed into the Soviet Union as part of an invasion force so large it was almost impossible to comprehend, and found, on the other side of that border, a war that would consume it slowly, over years of grinding, brutal, attritional combat. We will stand with them in the Ukrainian summer and the Russian winter. We will follow them to Kharkov and to Kursk, where the great armored battle of July 1943 would mark something the German military could not yet fully admit to itself, that the war in the East was no longer winnable. Then we will follow the division west, to Italy, briefly, and then to northern France, where a different kind of reckoning was waiting in the form of the Allied landings of June 1944. The Leibstandarte would meet those landings head-on in the Norman countryside, and it would find, in the hedgerows and sunken lanes of the bocage, that the war it had been built to fight was not the war it was now trapped inside. A retreat would begin that would not end until Germany itself had fallen. We will be there for all of it. 18 chapters, roughly 20 years of history, one formation, from its very first breath to its very last. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for nights exactly like this one. Long-form history told with care, told completely, told in a way that respects both the complexity of the subject and the time you are giving us. If this kind of content is what you come back for, then consider subscribing before you settle in. It helps us keep making these, and there is a great deal more where this is coming from. And if you are already a regular here, then you know the drill. Get comfortable, adjust your position, let the world outside go quiet for a while. Because we are going back, all the way back to the beginning, to a Germany that no longer exists, and a decision, made in that broken, angry country, by a small number of men who believed that total loyalty to one person was the highest possible calling, that would eventually shape the course of history for every nation on earth. This is the complete history of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte. Hitler's bodyguard army. Let's begin. Germany, 1923. A country fractured at the seams, its streets thick with the noise of competing futures. The war had ended 5 years before, but no one who lived through those years would have called it peace. Inflation had gutted the savings of ordinary families, reducing lifetimes of work to worthless paper. Veterans came home from the trenches to find there was no home to return to, only hunger, humiliation, and a republic that many of them refused to accept as legitimate. Into this atmosphere of rage and disorientation stepped a figure who understood, with an almost predatory instinct, the power of spectacle and the depth of ordinary desperation. Adolf Hitler was not yet the architect of catastrophe the world would come to know. He was still a provincial agitator, loud and magnetic, holding court in beer halls and back rooms, building something from the raw material of German bitterness. To move through a world as volatile as Weimar Germany was, to accept the constant possibility of violence. Political meetings routinely ended in brawls. Rival factions, communists, nationalists, royalists, veterans organizations, treated the streets of Munich and Berlin as contested terrain. Hitler himself had survived enough confrontations to understand that a man with ambitions required men willing to stand between him and the consequences of those ambitions. His early speaking engagements were raw, combustible events, where hecklers were dealt with not by debate, but by force. The men who handled this work were drawn from the toughest and most committed corners of his movement, individuals who combined physical capability with ideological devotion in roughly equal measure. They were not yet a formal institution. They were a necessity that had not yet found its proper name. The National Socialist movement had already developed a paramilitary wing by this point, the Sturmabteilung, known widely as the SA, or the Brown Shirts. This was a broad and unruly formation, more mob than military, useful for intimidation and street violence, but difficult to control and impossible to trust with anything delicate. Hitler's personal security was a different matter entirely. The men responsible for his physical safety needed to be of a different quality, answerable only to him, insulated from the factional quarrels and personal ambitions that churned constantly within the wider movement. What was required was something more like a Praetorian Guard, though no one at the time would have used that word openly. The need was practical before it was symbolic. The seeds of what would eventually become the Leibstandarte were planted in those early, unglamorous years, growing out of a small formation sometimes called the Stoßtrupp, a shock troop or assault detachment, drawn directly from Hitler's most trusted followers. These men were chosen not by any formal criterion, but by demonstrated loyalty, physical presence, and willingness to do whatever the moment demanded. They accompanied Hitler to his speeches, broke up disruptions before they could become serious, and made sure that anyone who intended him harm would meet a considerable obstacle before getting close. Their methods were blunt. Their effectiveness was real, and their relationship to their leader was already taking on a quality that went beyond employment or even duty, something closer to devotion. The failed beer hall putsch of November 1923 changed the trajectory of the entire movement, and with it, the nature of Hitler's personal guard. The attempted coup collapsed within a day, ending with gunfire in the streets of Munich and Hitler's arrest. He would spend time in Landsberg prison, using the months of confinement to write and to think, to transform a tactical failure into a strategic education. The lesson he drew was not that force was futile, but that it needed a firmer foundation, more disciplined organization, a broader base of support, and a more sophisticated approach to the accumulation of power. When he emerged from prison, the movement he rebuilt was subtly but significantly different, and the men around him would need to reflect that difference. The period between his release and the movement's eventual seizure of power was one of reconstruction and patient maneuvering. The paramilitary structures were rebuilt, recruitment expanded, and the ideological framework was sharpened and systematized. Through these years, the concept of personal loyalty to Hitler, loyalty that bypassed institutions, laws, and competing allegiances, became the central organizing principle of the inner circle. The men who would later form the core of his personal guard were selected and shaped during this period, drawn together not merely by shared politics, but by something more visceral. They believed, with a sincerity that needed no external validation, that they were bound to a man of historic destiny. Among those who emerged from this period as a defining figure in Hitler's personal protection was Josef Dietrich, known to almost everyone as Sepp. His background was as practical and unpolished as his personality, a former butcher's apprentice and tank crew member from the Great War, a man who had clawed his way through the chaos of post-war Bavaria with the kind of hard pragmatism that formal education rarely produces. Dietrich was not an intellectual. He was not a theorist. What he was, with remarkable consistency, was capable and loyal, a man who translated his devotion to Hitler into action. with very little visible deliberation. Hitler recognized in Dietrich something he valued enormously in the men around him: absolute reliability without the complicated ambition that plagued so many others. The ideological binding that held these men together deserves careful examination, because it was neither simple fanaticism nor pure opportunism, though it contained elements of both. National Socialism, as these early adherents experienced it, was less a coherent philosophy than an emotional experience, a story about national betrayal and national destiny, about enemies within and heroes waiting to reclaim what had been lost. For men who had lived through the trenches, through post-war poverty, through the grinding indignity of a defeated nation, this story offered an explanation and a purpose. To guard Hitler was not merely a job, it was participation in something they understood as sacred, a commitment made not to a man exactly, but to the idea of national salvation that the man embodied. This fusion of the personal and the ideological had practical consequences that would ripple forward across the entire history of the unit. It meant that orders from Hitler carried a weight that orders from any other authority simply could not match. It meant that conventional military restraints, the rules that governed how soldiers were supposed to behave, the limits that professional armies imposed on themselves, sat uneasily against the absolute loyalty these men felt. In the 1920s, this tension was largely theoretical. The unit was small, its operations were essentially those of bodyguards and brawlers, and the world it operated in was still, technically, a republic with functioning laws. What that fusion would mean in the context of genuine warfare was a question that had not yet been asked. By the close of the 1920s, as the Weimar Republic staggered through crisis after crisis, Hitler's personal guard had evolved from an improvised necessity into something with its own identity, its own traditions, and its own quiet pride in its relationship to the man at the center. They were still few in number, a tight cohort rather than a formation, but the character of the unit was already forming. The absolute primacy of loyalty over every other consideration, the physical standard expected of members, the sense of being categorically different from and superior to the broader movement. All of these were already present in embryonic form, waiting for the structures that would allow them to fully develop. Outside the beer halls and backroom meetings, most of Germany had no idea this unit existed. What was taking shape in the shadows of the early movement was invisible to ordinary observers. A private army of true believers, coalescing around a man who had not yet come close to power. But Germany in those years was a country where the invisible could become decisive very quickly, where structures built in obscurity could suddenly step into the light with enormous force. The men around Hitler were patient because they believed they were inevitable. The bodyguard that had begun as a practical response to the danger of political brawls was becoming something else, the human expression of a loyalty so total it recognized no authority above itself. The path from a handful of street-hardened devotees in Munich's tumultuous 1920s to one of the most heavily armed and extensively deployed formations of the Second World War was not yet visible to the men who were walking it. What they had in those early years was simpler and in some ways more powerful than any plan. They had certainty. Certainty about their leader, certainty about their purpose, certainty about their place in a story they believed was already written. That certainty would carry them through a decade of transformation, through the seizure of power, through expansion and hardening and war, until at last they would stand, armored, mechanized, and utterly changed from their origins, at the center of the most destructive conflict the world had ever produced. But the character was already there, set in those earliest years. Everything that followed was, in a sense, already contained in the moment, when the first man took his position beside Hitler and decided that this was where he belonged. By the spring of 1933, Adolf Hitler had achieved what many had dismissed as impossible. He had clawed his way from the margins of Weimar politics to the Chancellorship of Germany, and the machinery of the state was, piece by piece, falling into his hands. But power claimed is not the same as power secured. Around him swirled competing factions, ambitious rivals, and an army of brown shirts whose loyalty ran deep to their own commanders rather than to him personally. A man who had survived assassination attempts, prison, and political humiliation was not about to leave the question of his own protection to chance. What he needed was not merely a guard unit. He needed a living, breathing instrument of absolute personal loyalty, men who bore his name on their collar patches and answered to no authority on earth but his own. The formation that would carry that weight was officially constituted in the early months of that year, taking shape from the raw material of the protection detail that had already surrounded Hitler through the violent years of the rise. Josef Dietrich, the man Hitler trusted above almost all others with this task, was given authority to build something entirely new. Dietrich was a rough-edged Bavarian with a background in butchery and tanks, a veteran of the First World War who had fought in the mud of Flanders and understood instinctively what soldiers needed to function and to fight. He was not an intellectual, not a theorist, not a man who trafficked in abstractions. He was a builder, and what he built from the ground up, with his own hands and his own force of will. The men who served under him would come to regard him with something between fear and fierce devotion, a combination that Dietrich had a particular talent for inspiring. The unit's formal name, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, carried an unmistakable weight. In German military tradition, a Leibstandarte was a household guard, a formation sworn to protect a sovereign's person. By attaching Hitler's own name to it, the designation made explicit what other units only implied. This was not a guard of the state, not a guard of the party. This was a guard of one man, and that man's identity was inseparable from its own. The naming was a declaration as much as a designation, broadcasting to the military establishment, to the SA, to the foreign embassies that kept careful watch on German developments, exactly what kind of formation this was and who stood at its center. Every ceremony, every parade, every formal occasion at which these men appeared reinforced that message with precision. The process of separating the Leibstandarte from the broader SA was not merely administrative. It was a deliberate and carefully managed act of political distancing. The Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts who had been the muscle of the Nazi movement through the street battles of the 1920s, remained enormous, undisciplined, and restless. Their leadership harbored ambitions of transforming the SA into a genuine people's army that would absorb or displace the traditional Wehrmacht. Hitler had no intention of allowing that to happen, and the existence of a separate, elite household formation answerable only to him was one of the instruments through which he maintained that balance of competing powers. The Leibstandarte was carved out of the SA's orbit and placed under entirely distinct command structures, given separate funding, separate facilities, and a culture that deliberately set it apart from the brown shirt mass. What set the Leibstandarte apart most visibly in those early months was the rigor of its selection criteria. Dietrich was uncompromising on the point of physical standards. Recruits were required to meet height requirements that exceeded what most military services demanded, and the precise benchmarks were enforced with a consistency that left no room for exceptions. Beyond height, candidates were evaluated on overall physical condition, symmetry, bearing, and what Dietrich and his selectors called the look of a soldier, an almost instinctive quality that they claimed to recognize immediately and could not entirely reduce to numbers. Dental records were examined. Family backgrounds were investigated for the racial criteria that the Nazi state was in the process of codifying into law. The ideological apparatus that would eventually harden into the Nuremberg laws was still being assembled, but the Leibstandarte was already applying its spirit with full force in its intake process. Age was also a factor, carefully considered. The unit sought young men in their late teens and early 20s, whose characters could still be shaped, whose habits of thought were not yet fully formed. Dietrich understood, even if he would not have expressed it in such terms, that ideology is most effectively instilled in those who have not yet acquired the habit of questioning it. The recruits who passed selection entered a world of relentless physical conditioning and ideological formation in equal measure. Morning drills gave way to afternoon instruction, and the evenings brought political education sessions designed to fuse martial identity with National Socialist doctrine until the two became indistinguishable in the mind of each soldier. The Leibstandarte was not producing merely fighting men. It was producing a particular kind of human being, one who understood his own existence as an expression of the movement. Dietrich's approach to discipline was simultaneously demanding and personal. He walked the barracks, knew his men's names, appeared without warning at training exercises, and expected to find everything exactly as he had ordered it. When it was not, the consequences were swift and memorable. Yet there was also a quality in Dietrich that his men responded to beyond simple fear of punishment. He possessed a credibility that came from visible physical courage and a willingness to share discomfort. He did not simply order hardship. He had endured it himself, and his men knew it. That combination, the iron demand and the personal example, created a loyalty that was genuinely fierce rather than merely performed. Men who were selected for the Leibstandarte knew they had been chosen from thousands of applicants, and that knowledge shaped how they carried themselves every single day. The unit's uniform became a matter of almost obsessive attention. Black was the dominant color, not the field gray of the Wehrmacht, not the brown of the SA, but black, which carried its own symbolic register. The black uniform distinguished its wearer immediately and visually from every other formation in the German military and paramilitary world. It communicated exclusivity without requiring a word of explanation. The silver runes, the collar patches, the death's head insignia, each element was selected and standardized with deliberate care, and recruits were taught that the uniform was not clothing, but statement. How a man wore it was as important as whether he wore it at all, and inspections of dress and bearing were conducted with the same rigor as weapons drills. The visual identity of the Leibstandarte was being constructed as consciously as its military one. Through the middle months of 1933, the unit drilled and expanded in Berlin, its presence a regular feature of the ceremonial life of the new regime. Hitler reviewed his guardsmen with a visible satisfaction that he rarely displayed at purely military occasions. The Leibstandarte represented something personal to him, a proof of principle as much as a security arrangement. These were men who had chosen him, whose lives were organized entirely around him, and in a world still full of uncertainties and rival powers, that fact provided a psychological anchor that no amount of political maneuvering could entirely replicate. He attended their exercises, watched their drills, and on more than one occasion reportedly lingered longer than protocol required, reluctant to leave the site of the formation that bore his name. The relationship between the Leibstandarte and the regular German military establishment was uneasy from the beginning. Wehrmacht officers regarded the new formation with a mixture of disdain and wariness. They saw parade soldiers, men selected for height and bearing rather than tactical competence, political creatures dressed up in military uniform. The contempt was not entirely hidden, and the Leibstandarte's officers were aware of it. That awareness, rather than deflating the unit's sense of itself, sharpened it. Dietrich drove his men harder in direct response, insisting that no one would ever again dismiss them as decorative. The rivalry with the traditional military establishment became a fuel that burned consistently through the training grounds of those early years, and it would continue to burn long after the Leibstandarte had proved itself on actual battlefields. By the end of 1933, the outline of what the unit would become was already discernible. It was not yet a division, not yet a war machine, not yet the force that would fight across 3 continents. But its essential character had been established. The absolute personal loyalty, the exclusivity of membership, the insistence on physical and ideological perfection, the fierce pride in distinction from every other formation. These qualities had been built deliberately and would prove stubbornly durable, even as the unit grew from hundreds into thousands, and from a guard battalion into one of the most heavily armed divisions in the German order of battle. The foundation Dietrich had laid was not elegant, but it was solid, and it would hold through years of warfare that neither he nor his men could yet imagine. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was no longer becoming. It had arrived. By the summer of 1934, the Nazi state was not yet 2 years old, and already it was consuming itself from within. The streets that the Sturmabteilung had once owned, the corners where brown-shirted men had beaten opponents into silence, the beer halls where they had sung and sworn and built a movement out of fury, those streets now felt dangerous in a different way. The SA had grown enormous, swelling to perhaps 2 million men under the command of Ernst Röhm, one of the oldest and closest companions of Adolf Hitler. Röhm was a soldier's soldier, scarred and blunt, and he had ambitions that went well beyond breaking up political meetings. He wanted the SA absorbed into the Wehrmacht, wanted himself at the head of a genuine revolutionary army, and he made no great effort to hide it. That ambition placed him on a collision course with every other power center in Germany, the Wehrmacht Officer Corps, the SS, Hermann Göring, and ultimately with the man he considered his friend. In the corridors where decisions were being made quietly, the question was no longer whether something would happen to Rome, but when and who would carry it out. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was about to provide the answer. The accusations gathered against Rome and the SA leadership throughout the spring of that year had been constructed with care. Whether the threats attributed to them were genuine conspiracies or manufactured pretexts remains a matter for historians. But the political machinery of elimination had already begun to move. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich fed intelligence, real, distorted, and invented, upward to Hitler. Göring compiled his own dossiers. The Wehrmacht watched and waited, its generals quietly relieved that someone else was willing to do what they considered necessary. What emerged from this accumulation of pressure and paranoia was a plan, given the name Operation Hummingbird, that would be carried out over a single bloody weekend at the end of June. The Leibstandarte would not merely witness this operation, it would be one of its primary instruments. The orders came in the final days of June 1934. Sepp Dietrich received his instructions directly. A list of names and locations, a timetable measured in hours. What was asked of his men was not combat in any conventional sense. There would be no opposing army, no fortified position to storm. What was required was something colder and more deliberate. The arrest and execution of specific individuals, men who in many cases had known their killers for years. Dietrich selected teams from within the Leibstandarte and dispatched them across southern Germany. The unit that had been formed to protect Adolf Hitler was now being used to eliminate the men Hitler had decided were threats. The psychological weight of that transition, from guardian to executioner, cannot be overstated. And yet the men of the Leibstandarte carried out their orders with a thoroughness that left little room for hesitation. Loyalty, absolute and unconditional, was the defining currency of their world. At Stadelheim prison in Munich, Leibstandarte firing squads carried out executions of senior SA officers over the course of that terrible Saturday. The men brought before them were not strangers to violence. They had built careers upon it, but in those final moments the power they had accumulated counted for nothing. Dietrich himself was present for portions of the operation, overseeing with the cold efficiency that Hitler valued in him above almost any other quality. Across Germany, parallel actions were underway, carried out by SS units, Gestapo personnel, and Göring's forces in the north. But it was the Leibstandarte's direct participation in the Munich killings that placed the unit at the very center of the purge's most significant acts. Ernst Röhm was dealt with separately, given a brief and darkly absurd opportunity to take his own life before being shot when he refused. The man who had once dreamed of commanding the German army died in a prison cell, killed by an apparatus he had helped to build. By the time the weekend had passed, the killing had reached well beyond the SA leadership. Old scores were settled, inconvenient witnesses eliminated, personal enemies dispatched under the convenient cover of emergency necessity. The exact number of those killed in those days has never been established with certainty, but estimates have ranged from dozens to well over 100. The German cabinet met in the days that followed and passed a measure retroactively declaring the entire operation legal, a piece of legal theatre that fooled no one and was intended to fool no one. What mattered was not legality, but power, and the demonstration of power had been absolute. Hitler had shown that he could destroy even his oldest allies when they became inconvenient. Every institution in Germany absorbed that lesson. For the Leibstandarte, the consequences of those days were profound and lasting. The unit had not merely obeyed orders during the purge. It had performed with the kind of ruthless precision that elevated it, in Hitler's estimation, above every other formation in Germany. Where the SA had been loud, undisciplined, and ultimately threatening, the Leibstandarte had proven itself quiet, controlled, and absolutely his. In the weeks and months that followed, the rewards arrived in tangible form. The unit received new designations, expanded authorizations, and resources that other formations were denied. Its position within the hierarchy of Nazi power was no longer merely ceremonial. It had been earned through participation in something irreversible, and that participation created a bond between the unit and its Führer that operated on a deeper register than simple military loyalty. There was also a broader transformation taking place within the unit's identity during this period. Before the purge, the Leibstandarte existed in an awkward space, part bodyguard, part political symbol, part ceremonial fixture. Its men paraded at rallies and stood at gates and drove in motorcades. And while they trained with increasing seriousness under Dietrich's demanding eye, they had not yet proven themselves in the way that military formations are ultimately proven. The night of the long knives changed that calculus, though not through battlefield honor. It changed it through complicity. The men of the Leibstandarte now shared a secret with their Führer, and secrets of that particular kind forge bonds that ordinary military service cannot replicate. They had crossed a line together, and the crossing made retreat impossible. The Wehrmacht watched all of this with carefully measured expressions. The officer corps had been deeply uncomfortable with the SA's ambitions, and in that sense, Rome's elimination removed a rival they had feared. But the means by which it had been accomplished, the extrajudicial killings, the retroactive legislation, the use of SS and Leibstandarte formations to carry out what amounted to political murder, these things troubled men who still believed, or wished to believe, that Germany operated within some recognizable framework of law and order. Those concerns were noted and then suppressed, because the Wehrmacht's own future was dependent on continued cooperation with the regime. A dangerous precedent had been established, and every senior officer in Germany understood it, even as most chose to look away. Within the SS structure, the purge accelerated a process of institutional clarification that had been underway for some time. The SA, humiliated and leaderless, never recovered its former influence. It continued to exist as an organization, but its political power was broken, and the vast reservoir of street-level energy that Rome had commanded drained away into irrelevance. Into the space the SA had vacated, the SS expanded with deliberate speed. Himmler's organization absorbed functions, personnel, and authority that had previously been contested. The Leibstandarte, as the most visible and prestigious element of the SS, benefited directly from this expansion. It was increasingly understood not as a separate entity orbiting the Nazi state, but as the sharpest point of an instrument that now extended through every dimension of German life. The unit's ideology also hardened during this consolidation period. The men who joined in the years following the purge entered an organization that understood itself to be fundamentally different from any conventional military formation. Selection criteria remained extraordinarily rigorous. Physical requirements that excluded the vast majority of applicants. Racial documentation requirements that traced family histories back across generations. And an ideological screening process that sought to confirm not merely obedience, but genuine belief. The Leibstandarte was not supposed to be an army that followed orders. It was supposed to be a community of the ideologically committed, men who would act not because they were commanded to, but because they understood and embraced what was being asked of them. Whether the rank and file genuinely embodied this ideal, or merely performed it, is a question the historical record answers differently, case by case. But the institutional aspiration was clear and consistently reinforced. By the close of 1934, the Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, had completed a transformation that could not have been predicted even 2 years earlier. What had begun as a personal protection detail, assembled from the most loyal of Hitler's followers, had passed through a political crucible and emerged as something genuinely new in German military life. It was not yet the fully formed armored division that would roll across the borders of Europe in the years ahead. It was still a relatively modest formation by the standards of what was coming, but its character had been defined, its loyalty demonstrated in the most irreversible terms available, and its place within the hierarchy of Nazi power secured in ways that no amount of parade ground perfection could have accomplished. The blood of the purge had sealed something between the Leibstandarte and its Führer that would bind them across all the years of war to come, binding them not only in glory and triumph, but in the weight of what they had already become. By 1935, something fundamental had shifted in Germany. The republic that had stumbled through the previous decade was gone, replaced by a state that measured its ambitions in the language of steel and territory. Adolf Hitler had consolidated power with a thoroughness that left no serious rival standing, and the forces that had helped him do so were now being reshaped into instruments of a new kind of war. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler stood at the center of this transformation, no longer a band of ceremonial guards whose primary function was standing rigid at attention outside the Reich chancellery, but a formation being deliberately, methodically rebuilt into something that could fight, advance, and kill on a modern battlefield. The process was deliberate, and it was unhurried, because the men directing it understood that credibility required time. To march in parades was one thing. To hold a defensive line against artillery was another thing entirely, and the gap between those two realities had to be closed before any real test came. Sepp Dietrich remained the commanding figure of the Leibstandarte throughout this period, and his personality shaped the unit's culture in ways that formal regulations never quite could. He was not a man of formal military education in the classical sense. He had risen through street politics and loyalty, rather than through the officer academies that produced the Wehrmacht's professional cadre. Yet he possessed an instinctive understanding of men under pressure and what it took to keep them cohesive. His relationship with his troops was direct, occasionally brutal, in the manner of a man who had known hard physical work long before he knew power, and it generated a fierce reciprocal loyalty. The officers beneath him were being drawn increasingly from a pool of younger men who combined fanatical political commitment with genuine professional ambition, and the combination was volatile in a way that the old Wehrmacht establishment found both impressive and unsettling. Dietrich was building something that existed outside the normal hierarchy, and he was doing it with the full backing of a man who lived in the Reich Chancellery. The formal military expansion of the Leibstandarte during this period meant acquiring not just manpower, but the equipment of a modern fighting force. Where the unit had previously carried rifles and sidearms, it now began to receive heavy weapons, machine guns in sustained fire configurations, mortars, anti-tank guns, and eventually artillery. The integration of these weapons required a corresponding shift in how men were trained, because a soldier who understands only close-order drill and personal weapons is a different creature from one who can coordinate indirect fire with infantry movement. Specialist schools were established, instructors were brought in, and men who had been recruited partly for their height and their racial documentation now found themselves crouching over technical manuals and running exercises in mud and rain alongside equipment that had no ceremonial function whatsoever. The change in atmosphere was noticeable even at the level of daily routine. The parade ground was still present, still used, still valued, but it was no longer the whole world. Germany's formal repudiation of the military restrictions imposed after the First World War gave the Leibstandarte's expansion a new legal framework and a new psychological permission. The announcement of conscription, the open declaration of rearmament, the rebuilding of the Luftwaffe, all of these developments normalized what the Leibstandarte was doing. Where the unit had previously occupied an ambiguous space between political militia and military formation, it could now operate more openly within a Germany that was rearming without apology. The Wehrmacht itself was expanding at a pace that stretched its institutional capacity, and this created a strange double situation. The Leibstandarte needed the Wehrmacht's expertise in order to develop as a proper military force, while the Wehrmacht's generals regarded the Leibstandarte with a mixture of contempt and wariness. The contempt came from the belief that political soldiers were not real soldiers. The wariness came from the recognition that these particular political soldiers had access to the Führer that no general could match. The tension between the Leibstandarte and the traditional military establishment was not merely a matter of institutional ego. It touched on something deeper, which was the question of where ultimate military authority resided in the new Germany. The Wehrmacht officers who trained alongside Leibstandarte personnel on joint exercises were professionally obligated to observe certain standards of performance and to report honestly on what they saw. What they saw was sometimes impressive and sometimes not. The Leibstandarte's physical standards were consistently high. The men were well selected, well fed, and genuinely motivated. But tactical sophistication takes years to develop, and there were moments during exercises when the gap between enthusiasm and professionalism showed clearly. Some Wehrmacht observers noted these shortcomings in their reports. The Leibstandarte noted that those reports did not seem to slow its expansion or diminish its access to resources. The peacetime rallies and public ceremonies of the Nazi state served a function beyond political theatre, though political theatre was undeniably their primary purpose. For the Leibstandarte, these events provided something that purely military training could not: the experience of operating under the direct observation of the highest political leadership, managing enormous logistical requirements, coordinating with multiple agencies, and maintaining the kind of collective presence that conveyed power rather than merely possessing it. The Nuremberg rallies in particular required weeks of preparation and involved thousands of troops in configurations that demanded precise coordination. Moving that many men, feeding them, ensuring their equipment was immaculate, positioning them according to elaborate choreography, all of this developed organizational muscle that would later prove useful in contexts where the choreography was replaced by incoming fire. The discipline was real, even if the occasion was spectacle. Throughout this period, recruitment into the Leibstandarte remained both highly selective and increasingly systematized. The physical requirements stayed stringent: height minimums, health standards, age restrictions. But the documentation requirements also intensified, reflecting the racial ideology that underpinned the entire formation. A man seeking admission needed to demonstrate his ancestry across multiple generations according to the regime's racial criteria, a process that consumed considerable bureaucratic energy and reinforced the unit's self-conception as something categorically separate from ordinary military forces. The effect of this selection process on unit culture was significant and double-edged. It created a strong sense of collective identity and group pride, a belief that membership in the Leibstandarte represented a genuine distinction. It also created insularity and a tendency towards self-referential thinking that would later generate its own complications in actual combat, where the enemy's intentions rarely accommodated ideological certainty. The Leibstandarte's relationship with the civilian population of Germany during this period was shaped heavily by its ceremonial and symbolic functions. Wherever it appeared, whether guarding the Reich Chancellery, escorting Hitler on official occasions, or participating in public demonstrations of German military revival, it represented the regime's aesthetic vision of the ideal German soldier: tall, blonde where possible, uniformed with precision, conveying an impression of disciplined strength. This public visibility had practical consequences for recruitment, since young Germans who watched these men march could form aspirations. It also had consequences for how the unit understood itself, because organizations that become accustomed to public admiration develop a certain relationship with their own mythology that is not always easy to distinguish from simple vanity. The Leibstandarte was being watched, and it knew it, and this knowledge shaped behavior in ways both constructive and otherwise. The years between 1935 and 1937 also saw the consolidation of the Waffen-SS framework, of which the Leibstandarte formed the most visible component. Heinrich Himmler's ambitions for the SS, as an organization, extended well beyond police functions and racial administration. He wanted an armed force that would eventually rival the Wehrmacht in capability and surpass it in ideological purity. The Leibstandarte was the flagship of this vision, and resources flowed accordingly. The tension between Himmler's institutional goals and Dietrich's more practical military instincts ran beneath the surface of daily operations without fully erupting during these years, held in check by the shared objective of building something impressive. Himmler needed capable soldiers to legitimize his SS empire. Dietrich needed Himmler's institutional backing to sustain the resources that made the Leibstandarte a real military unit. Both men needed Hitler's continued favor, and both understood that this favor was maintained through results that the Führer could observe and approve. The joint exercises conducted with Wehrmacht formations during this period were more significant than their peacetime character might suggest. For the first time, Leibstandarte officers were working alongside conventional military professionals in structured tactical environments where performance could be observed and compared. Some of these experiences were humbling, particularly in technical areas where the Wehrmacht's accumulated institutional knowledge gave it clear advantages. Others were revealing in the opposite direction, in physical endurance, in willingness to push through discomfort, in the kind of aggressive forward momentum that characterizes troops who have been told repeatedly that they are exceptional. Leibstandarte men frequently exceeded expectations. The lessons flowed in both directions, even if neither institution was inclined to admit it. What emerged gradually from this friction was something closer to a military formation that could plausibly fight alongside or against professionals. By the close of 1937, the Leibstandarte had traveled a considerable distance from the personal security detail that had formed a decade earlier in the turbulent politics of Weimar Germany. It was not yet the full division it would eventually become, but it was something considerably more substantial than it had been. A motorized infantry regiment with organic heavy weapons, trained by a combination of SS instructors and Wehrmacht professionals, staffed by officers who took their military responsibilities seriously, even when ideology colored their every decision, and backed by a state whose rearmament program was by this point proceeding at a pace that alarmed observers across Europe. The men who made up this force had been selected for their physical presence and their political reliability, but they had also spent years being trained to close with an enemy and destroy him, and that training had taken hold. The ceremonies and the symbolism had not disappeared. They would never entirely disappear from a unit so bound to the theater of the Nazi state, but they now existed alongside something harder and more dangerous. What lay ahead was a question that most of Europe was quietly asking, without yet knowing the full weight of the answer. The Wehrmacht was preparing for operations that would test everything it had rebuilt, and the Leibstandarte would move alongside it into whatever came next. The ceremonial guard had become a fighting unit. The fighting unit was about to find out what that actually meant. Not on a parade ground with cameras watching and crowds cheering, but in the grey, particular reality of armed conflict. First in territories that fell without great resistance, and then, eventually, in places where resistance was everything. The foundations had been laid with considerable care and considerable resources. The structure built upon them would be tested in ways that no peacetime exercise could fully anticipate, against opponents who had not read the same mythology and were not moved by it. For years, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had existed in a peculiar space between spectacle and menace. Its men had stood at gates, lined parade routes, and flanked their Führer at the great choreographed displays of Nazi power. They had crushed enemies within the movement on a single, bloody summer night. They had drilled and trained and hardened through the mid-1930s with the discipline of men who believed themselves the finest soldiers in the world. But belief and proof are different things. A unit can polish its boots to a mirror shine and still be untested beyond the borders of its own mythology. By the spring of 1938, that was about to change. To the south, Austria waited, and with it, the first opportunity for the Leibstandarte to move beyond Germany, not as a guard of honor, but as an armed instrument of political will. The roots of what would happen in March of 1938 ran deep into the previous decade. Austria and Germany shared a language, a culture, and for many on the German nationalist right, a destiny that had been artificially severed by the post-war settlement. Hitler himself was Austrian by birth, and the idea of bringing his homeland into the greater German Reich was not merely strategic ambition, it was personal. For years, German pressure on Vienna had mounted through diplomatic manipulation, economic leverage, and the constant agitation of Austrian National Socialists, who answered ultimately to Berlin rather than to their own government. The Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, had spent much of his tenure trying to balance these forces without yielding everything. By early 1938, that balance was collapsing. In February of that year, Schuschnigg was summoned to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, and the meeting was less a diplomatic exchange than an extended act of intimidation. Hitler raged, threatened, and demanded the appointment of Austrian Nazis to key government positions. Schuschnigg, shaken but not yet broken, complied enough to leave, but what he did next was a gamble that he must have known was dangerous. He announced a national referendum to be held in the second week of March, asking the Austrian people whether they wished to remain independent. The question was framed to favor a yes vote. It was a direct challenge to Berlin, and Berlin responded with the logic of force. Within days, the pressure became a demand, and the demand became an ultimatum. German troops would cross the border unless Schuschnigg resigned and handed power to the Austrian Nazi interior minister. Facing the reality of German military strength massed at the frontier, with no credible Allied support forthcoming, Schuschnigg stepped down. The radio broadcast of his resignation on the evening of the 11th of March 1938 was one of the most quietly devastating moments of the pre-war years. A man's voice, composed and exhausted in equal measure, telling his country that he had chosen to yield rather than see German blood spilled. Austrian Nazis seized the chancellery almost before the echo of his words had faded. German forces crossed the border in the early hours of the 12th of March. Among them, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The unit had been placed on alert days earlier, its men drawn from their barracks, with the particular electric tension that comes when training gives way to something that is unambiguously real. They crossed into Austria as part of the broader military column, tanks, artillery, motorized infantry, moving through a landscape that was, technically, foreign territory for the first time. The crossing was not a combat assault. There were no fortified lines to break. Austrian resistance, such as it was, dissolved almost at once, and in many towns along the route, the reception was something closer to celebration than confrontation, with crowds lining the roads and flowers thrown toward German vehicles. But the significance of the crossing was not diminished by the absence of battle. For the Leibstandarte, this was a threshold moment. The unit was now operating outside German borders as a military force, its men carrying loaded weapons through streets where the political situation remained genuinely uncertain in those first hours. The Austrian army had not formally surrendered when the first German columns moved. Pockets of potential resistance existed, at least in theory, and the men of the Leibstandarte understood that the situation could shift. They moved through this ambiguity with the controlled aggression of soldiers who had trained for years and were now, finally, proving that the training had meant something. The column pressed south toward Vienna, the city Hitler had once wandered as a failed artist and political dreamer, sleeping in shelters and selling watercolors on the street. Now he would return as the man who had swallowed it whole. The Leibstandarte's role in the advance was both practical and symbolic. It was present as a fighting formation, but it was also present as a statement. Where the Leibstandarte appeared, Hitler's personal authority appeared with it. The unit was not merely part of the Wehrmacht column. It was the most visible expression of the Führer's reach into his former homeland. Hitler himself crossed into Austria later that same day, entering his birthplace of Braunau am Inn to scenes of frenzied enthusiasm that the regime's cameras captured and broadcast across Germany. The crowds were real, whatever the complexity of Austrian political opinion beneath the surface. In Vienna, the reception was vast and chaotic, tens of thousands gathering in the Heldenplatz, Heroes Square, to hear Hitler speak from the balcony of the Hofburg Palace. The Leibstandarte provided security and ceremonial presence for these appearances, reverting momentarily to its oldest function as personal guard. But the men who stood at attention along those routes had arrived there as soldiers, not servants, and the distinction was noted. The operation was complete with extraordinary speed. Within days, the formal annexation, the Anschluss, meaning simply the connection or joining, was declared, and Austria ceased to exist as a separate state, becoming instead the Ostmark, the Eastern March of the Greater German Reich. A plebiscite held shortly after recorded overwhelming approval, though it was conducted under circumstances that made genuine dissent effectively impossible. For the outside world, the speed and smoothness of the whole affair was startling. Britain and France registered protest and did nothing more. The international architecture of collective security, already weakened by years of accommodation, bent again and held. For the Leibstandarte, the after-action evaluation was largely positive. The unit had moved efficiently, maintained order within its columns, and demonstrated that it could operate as a functional military formation beyond the controlled environments of German training grounds and parade grounds. Sepp Dietrich, whose blunt personality and tactical instincts had shaped the unit since its earliest years, had reason to feel his work was being validated. The men themselves had absorbed something that no amount of drilling in a German courtyard could have provided: the particular education of moving through genuinely uncertain territory with weapons in their hands and orders to complete. There were also harder lessons embedded in the Austrian operation, though they were not the kind that appeared in official reports. The ease of the advance could breed a particular kind of overconfidence, the belief that military superiority, combined with political audacity, would always dissolve resistance before it could form. The world beyond Germany's borders had not fought back. The columns had moved through, the flags had gone up, and the crowds had cheered. It was difficult, from inside that experience, to fully imagine that the next operation would be different. Among the Leibstandarte's officers and men, the Anschluss left a residue of confirmation, a sense that they were exactly what they had always believed themselves to be, and that the world would continue to accommodate that belief. What the unit carried away from Austria was something beyond tactical experience. It had crossed a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The Leibstandarte was no longer a domestic security force with military ambitions. It was a formation that had moved on armed orders into foreign territory, however peacefully that territory had been absorbed. The ceremonies and the guard duties and the Munich beer hall origins were not erased, but they receded further into the past, with every kilometre the columns had covered on Austrian roads. The coming months would bring the Sudetenland, then Poland, then something far larger than any of them could yet fully picture. But Austria was where the journey beyond Germany's borders began, and the Leibstandarte had been there, at the front of the column, exactly where its Führer intended it to be. After the roads of Austria had fallen quiet, and the last of the welcoming crowds had gone home, the Leibstandarte returned to Germany, carrying something new, not wounds. The march through Vienna had cost them nothing in blood. What they carried back was confidence, a settled certainty that they were not merely a ceremonial formation dressed in fine uniforms to stand at attention while the world watched. They had moved across an international border as a military force. They had occupied territory. They had felt the weight of real deployment beneath their boots. And that feeling changed a unit the way few training exercises ever could. Within weeks of returning, the senior officers were already exchanging assessments. The march had gone smoothly, but smoothly was not enough. If the next order came, and there was very little doubt among anyone close to the high command that another order would come, the Leibstandarte needed to be ready not for a parade, but for a war. The political climate of 1938 did not allow much time for rest. Hitler's ambitions had not paused at the Austrian border, and the men at the top of the Nazi state understood this, even when it was not spoken aloud in formal briefings. The Sudetenland, that western arc of Czechoslovakia, where ethnic Germans formed the majority of the population, had become the next point of pressure. Hitler had been applying diplomatic force to the Czechoslovak government and to the European powers for months, framing the issue as one of self-determination, while his generals drew plans on maps. For the Leibstandarte, this translated directly into operational preparation. Sepp Dietrich drove his officers hard through the summer months, insisting on a standard of mechanical readiness, infantry coordination, and march discipline that went beyond anything the unit had previously attempted. The lessons of Austria, how quickly vehicles had broken down, how logistical gaps had appeared even during a bloodless operation, had been absorbed and were now being corrected with genuine urgency. By late summer, the European crisis had reached a point where conflict seemed almost certain. The great powers of Britain and France maneuvered diplomatically, fearful of another continental war. Barely 2 decades after the last one had broken an entire generation. Then came Munich. In late September of 1938, British and French representatives sat across a table with Hitler and agreed, without the presence of Czechoslovak negotiators, to the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany. It was a moment that stunned the world in different ways, some with relief, others with dread. For Hitler, it was a triumph of pressure over resistance. For the Leibstandarte, it was an activation order. Within days of the agreement, German forces began moving toward the Czechoslovak border, and the Leibstandarte moved with them. Once again, they would march into territory without firing a shot, but the context this time carried a sharper edge. A sovereign nation was being stripped of its defensive borderlands, and everyone in a uniform knew it. The occupation of the Sudetenland in early October of 1938 unfolded with the same choreographed order the Anschluss had displayed, but with a different atmosphere. In Austria, there had been genuine crowds of cheering people along many stretches of the route. Here, the welcome was uneven. In some towns, the ethnic German population turned out with flags and flowers. In others, the Czech inhabitants watched in silence as columns of vehicles moved through their streets, and that silence carried its own particular weight. The Leibstandarte conducted itself as a military occupying force rather than a liberating parade, and this distinction, subtle as it might seem from a distance, sharpened the men's understanding of what they actually were. They were not peacekeepers, they were not diplomats in uniform. They were the armed expression of a political will, and the people watching from the roadside could feel the difference, even if the newsreels back in Germany told a different story. For Sepp Dietrich, the Sudetenland operation confirmed a conclusion he had been moving toward for some time. The Leibstandarte needed to stop thinking of itself as a large regiment and start functioning as the nucleus of a genuine division. The unit had expanded significantly since its earliest days, but expansion in numbers meant very little without corresponding expansion in capability. Dietrich pushed relentlessly for heavier weapons allocations, for artillery support units to be attached, for the training of dedicated signals personnel and engineers. He was not always successful immediately. The Wehrmacht's senior leadership still regarded the Waffen-SS formations with a mixture of institutional rivalry and barely concealed condescension. But the political protection that came from being Hitler's own formation gave Dietrich a lever that regular army commanders did not possess. When he needed something, and the normal channels moved too slowly, there were other channels available to him. The winter of 1938 and the early months of 1939 brought no reduction in tempo. If anything, the pace of preparation accelerated, as it became increasingly clear that the appetite that had consumed Austria and the Sudetenland was not yet satisfied. In March of 1939, German forces completed the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, occupying Prague and establishing a German protectorate over Bohemia and Moravia. The Leibstandarte participated in this operation, once again crossing an international boundary without firing a shot, once again securing territory through presence and threat rather than combat. But the political calculus of Europe had shifted sharply. Britain and France had watched Munich with unease and Prague with alarm. Guarantees were extended to Poland. The architecture of appeasement was visibly cracking, and the men of the Leibstandarte who read the situation honestly understood that the next march would not be bloodless. The ideological dimension of the unit's life had never been absent, but through this period, it intensified with a deliberateness that was hard to miss. The SS belief system, centered on race, hierarchy, absolute loyalty to Hitler, and a particular vision of Germanic destiny, was not simply the background noise of the Leibstandarte's existence. It was actively reinforced through structured sessions, through the culture maintained by officers, through the rituals and language that saturated daily life in a Waffen-SS formation. Recruits who arrived with only a general nationalist orientation found themselves, over months of immersion, shaped into something more committed and more specific. The unit did not simply want soldiers who could fight. It wanted soldiers who believed without reservation in why they were fighting, and that belief was cultivated with the same systematic attention that was applied to marksmanship or vehicle maintenance. Recruitment through this period reflected the ambitions of the leadership. The physical and racial criteria that had defined the Leibstandarte since its earliest days remained rigidly enforced. Potential members were measured, assessed, and evaluated according to standards that combined genuine physical fitness requirements with the pseudo-scientific racial categories the SS had enshrined in its ideology. The result was a unit that looked a particular way and that understood itself as a particular kind of formation, separate not just from the regular army, but from other SS units as well. There was a hierarchy of prestige within the broader SS structure, and the Leibstandarte sat at its summit. Men within the unit carried this self-perception into everything they did, and their officers actively encouraged it, understanding that elite identity, even when partly manufactured, produced soldiers who fought with exceptional determination. The relationship between the Leibstandarte and the regular Wehrmacht continued to carry tension through this period, though the tension expressed itself more in bureaucratic friction than in open conflict. Army commanders resented the privileged access to resources and the political protection that Waffen-SS formations enjoyed. They questioned whether formations trained along ideological lines, rather than purely military ones, could match the professional standards of Germany's traditional military. Some of these criticisms were made in memos and private conversations. A few found their way into formal objections. The Leibstandarte's officers were aware of the skepticism and responded to it in the way soldiers almost always respond to doubt from rivals. They pushed harder in training and waited for an opportunity to demonstrate their worth in the field. Poland was coming. Everyone could feel it. Through the summer of 1939, as Hitler's pressure on Poland escalated and diplomatic efforts collapsed in sequence, the Leibstandarte prepared with a focused intensity that went beyond any previous readiness cycle. Live fire exercises increased. Combined arms coordination. Infantry working with armor and artillery in the integrated way that modern warfare demanded was practiced repeatedly. Officers studied their maps of Polish terrain, considered the problems of river crossings and urban combat, and planned for a campaign that would not be a march through cheering crowds, but actual warfare against an opponent who intended to resist. The men could feel the shift in atmosphere. The jokes and the smaller concerns of garrison life had receded. There was a quality of attention in the barracks and on the training grounds that had not been there before. What the 1938 operations had given the Leibstandarte, beyond experience and confidence, was a set of assumptions that would both serve the unit well and carry within them the seeds of later problems. The assumption that German force would produce rapid results. The assumption that opponents would not resist or would be quickly overcome. The assumption that the political and diplomatic environment would continue to yield to pressure. These assumptions were not entirely wrong. Poland would fall in less than a month of hard fighting, but they belonged to a particular moment that was already passing. The world that had offered Germany one bloodless conquest after another was closing. What waited beyond the Polish border was not another parade, but the beginning of something that would grind on for nearly 6 years and consume everything it touched. By the final days of August 1939, the Leibstandarte was in position, integrated into the German order of battle, its vehicles fueled and its men ready. The unit that had spent the 1930s growing from a bodyguard detail into a combat formation now stood at the edge of real war. The officers who had spent years training these men, hardening them, shaping their beliefs and their reflexes, were about to learn which of their preparations had been adequate and which had not. The political drama of Munich and Prague, the bloodless marches, the careful expansion and ideological cultivation, all of it had been, in a sense, prologue. September was about to begin. In the final days of August 1939, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler stood assembled on the German border with Poland, poised at the threshold of a new and terrible chapter in European history. The unit had grown considerably since its establishment 6 years prior, no longer merely a ceremonial bodyguard, but a fully militarized division of some 6,000 men, equipped with rifles, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and supporting artillery. The soldiers were young, many of them fanatically devoted to Nazi ideology, trained exhaustively in rapid assault tactics, and eager to prove themselves in actual combat. Their commanders, led by officers who had risen through the ranks of the Nazi Party and the Leibstandarte itself, radiated absolute confidence. The atmosphere crackled with tension and anticipation. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 1st of September, as dawn broke over the Polish landscape, the invasion began, and the Leibstandarte rolled forward into war, crossing the frontier with the German forces that would sweep across Poland in a devastating campaign lasting only weeks. The invasion was coordinated with overwhelming precision. The Luftwaffe struck first, catching the Polish Air Force on the ground, and massive mechanized columns of German armor and motorized infantry pushed into Polish territory along multiple axes of advance. The Leibstandarte, operating under Wehrmacht command structure during this phase, was assigned to a corps-level formation and tasked with rapid penetration and exploitation of breakthroughs achieved by regular Wehrmacht Panzer and infantry divisions. The unit's mission was not to hold ground, but to move fast, strike hard, and maintain momentum, driving deep into enemy territory to cut off Polish retreat routes and create encirclement. The Polish army, although fighting with considerable courage and desperation, was simply outmatched in terms of equipment, coordination, and numbers. Polish cavalry and infantry, armed largely with rifles and light machine guns, could offer only determined but ultimately futile resistance against German mechanized firepower. Within days, it became clear that Poland faced not a conventional military contest, but annihilation, a blitzkrieg strategy designed to destroy organized Polish forces and seize the entire nation in a matter of weeks rather than months. The Leibstandarte's first significant engagement came in the opening week of the invasion, as Polish units attempted to mount defensive stands along natural obstacles and prepared positions. The fighting around the town of Pabianice and in the regions surrounding Warsaw exposed the unit to real combat for the first time on a substantial scale. Here, against Polish infantry and occasional counter-attacking formations, the Leibstandarte's soldiers experienced the disorientation and terror of actual warfare, the sudden appearance of enemy fire, the chaos of movement under hostile conditions, the sound of bullets striking metal and flesh. Young men who had trained relentlessly but never faced an enemy suddenly understood the brutal gap between training and reality. Some panicked. Others responded with the training they had absorbed, returning fire, taking cover, advancing methodically under suppressive fire. Officers and non-commissioned officers shouted orders, rallied their men, and pushed the attack forward with grim determination. The Polish defenders, despite their bravery, lacked the firepower and coordination to halt the German advance, and they were overrun by superior numbers and mechanized assault. The casualties mounted, and the Leibstandarte suffered its first dead and wounded. Many of these men were city boys from Berlin, Munich, and other German urban centers, 19 and 20 years old, now learning that ideology and loyalty meant little when confronted with the reality of combat and death. The campaign unfolded with remorseless efficiency. Polish units were encircled and destroyed piecemeal as German forces advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. The Leibstandarte, driving hard and suffering increasing casualties as Polish resistance stiffened in certain sectors, became known among Wehrmacht formations for its aggressiveness and willingness to accept losses in pursuit of breakthrough. The unit pushed through the corridor toward Warsaw, engaging Polish forces attempting to delay the German advance through rearguard actions and counterattacks. In the villages and towns the Leibstandarte passed through, the soldiers encountered the human cost of invasion, Polish civilians fleeing the fighting, destruction wrought by German artillery and air power, the visible signs of a nation being dismantled. The unit's ideology, the racial doctrines, and ideological rigidity that had been drilled into its members for years began to manifest in ways that went beyond conventional military operations. Reports emerged of brutality against Polish civilians and prisoners of war, acts that would become increasingly characteristic of the Leibstandarte's conduct as the war progressed and as the conflict on the Eastern Front evolved into something far more savage than traditional warfare. By mid-September, the Wehrmacht had encircled the Polish army in a vast pocket near Warsaw, and the final phase of destruction commenced. The Leibstandarte, along with other Wehrmacht divisions, contracted the encirclement, crushing Polish forces from all sides. The fighting was intense but brief. Polish ammunition and food ran low, reinforcements were impossible, and organized resistance collapsed into desperate attempts to break through German lines or surrender. The Leibstandarte's casualty count rose significantly during this phase. By the end of September, when Polish resistance finally ceased and the campaign concluded, the unit had suffered more than 600 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. These were devastating losses for a unit of its size, roughly 10% of its entire strength lost in a single month of combat. Yet from the German perspective, from the viewpoint of Nazi propaganda and the Leibstandarte's own internal assessment, the campaign had been a triumph. The unit had fought effectively, had contributed to the swift destruction of Polish military forces, and had demonstrated that it could function as a combat division, not merely as ceremonial guard. The experience of the Polish campaign transformed the Leibstandarte in profound ways. The unit had tasted combat and victory. Its soldiers had proven themselves capable of fighting a real enemy and prevailing, and this knowledge infused the unit with confidence and a growing sense of martial identity. The ideology that bound the unit together, the Nazi racial doctrines, the devotion to Hitler, the sense of being a chosen elite, now seemed validated by actual combat success. Simultaneously, the campaign exposed the brutal nature of what modern warfare truly meant. The young men of the Leibstandarte had learned that combat was not the heroic glory suggested by Nazi ideology, but a terrifying, chaotic experience in which friends died, bodies were torn apart, and victory came at the cost of blood and terror. Some of these men would carry this knowledge throughout the remainder of the war. Others would internalize the brutality and become increasingly hardened, increasingly willing to commit acts of violence, not merely as military necessity, but as expression of ideology and hatred. The division between legitimate military operations and war crimes, never clearly drawn within Nazi ideology, began to blur even during these early days of the conflict. The invasion of Poland also revealed the Leibstandarte's relationship with the regular Wehrmacht and its position within the broader German military hierarchy. The unit operated under Wehrmacht command during the campaign, not as an independent force. This subordination to regular military authority would prove temporary. As the war progressed, and as the strategic situation evolved, the Leibstandarte and other Nazi Party military formations would increasingly operate under their own command structures, answering to Nazi Party leadership rather than strictly to traditional Wehrmacht command. During the Polish campaign, this distinction was not yet fully apparent, but the seeds of the later development were already present. The unit's commanders, particularly Sepp Dietrich, who remained closely associated with the formation, began to recognize the Leibstandarte's potential as more than merely a guard unit. Here was an organization that combined ideological fanaticism with military discipline and the willingness to accept losses in pursuit of objectives. It was, in essence, the perfect instrument for Nazi warfare, politically reliable, ideologically committed, and militarily effective. The aftermath of the Polish invasion raised the Leibstandarte's profile within Nazi Germany considerably. Propaganda accounts of the unit's combat performance circulated widely. Veterans of the campaign spoke of rapid breakthroughs, aggressive assaults, and crushing victories. The unit's reputation for ruthlessness and determination grew with each retelling. Recruitment accelerated dramatically following the campaign. Young men across Germany, inspired by tales of military glory and combat effectiveness, sought to join an organization that had proven itself on the battlefield. The political leadership in Berlin, Hitler and his immediate circle, noted the Leibstandarte's performance with approval. Here was tangible evidence that Nazi Party military formations could compete effectively with traditional Wehrmacht units. This recognition would have enormous consequences for the remainder of the war. The Leibstandarte, having established itself in combat, would expand rapidly and would be committed repeatedly to the most critical operations, granted greater autonomy and resources, and treated as a premier formation worthy of Hitler's personal attention and confidence. Yet the victory in Poland concealed enormous challenges that would emerge as the war continued. The Leibstandarte had suffered significant casualties, despite facing a relatively poorly equipped opponent without air superiority or the capacity for coordinated large-scale counteroffensive. The unit's supply lines had proven susceptible to disruption, its coordination with other formations sometimes problematic, and its medical and rear area support initially inadequate for the scale of combat it had experienced. As the invasion of Poland concluded, and the unit withdrew for rest, reorganization, and integration of replacements, these weaknesses began to be addressed. However, the fundamental reality remained. The Leibstandarte, for all its training and ideology, had discovered that combat efficiency required constant learning, ruthless attention to detail, and willingness to adapt tactics and procedures based on actual battlefield experience. The unit's commanders began immediately to implement lessons learned, to reorganize units that had suffered heavy casualties, and to incorporate new equipment and tactics developed or refined during the Polish campaign. The invasion of Poland also marked a psychological turning point for the Leibstandarte and for Germany more broadly. The operation had succeeded with shocking rapidity, confirming Nazi strategic theories about the power of mechanized warfare and rapid breakthrough tactics. It had validated Hitler's strategic judgments and demonstrated that German military forces, properly organized and ideologically motivated, could overcome any opposition. This belief, dangerous in its certainty, intoxicating in its apparent validation, would shape German strategy and operations throughout the subsequent years of the war. The Leibstandarte absorbed this sense of invincibility, even as its soldiers learned the harsh realities of combat. The combination of proven military effectiveness, ideological commitment, and the apparent vindication of Nazi strategic concepts created an organization that was increasingly confident, increasingly aggressive, and increasingly willing to embrace violence as the solution to perceived challenges. As the unit withdrew from Poland in the autumn of 1939, new recruits arrived to replace the fallen and wounded. Officers and non-commissioned officers began training for the anticipated next campaign. The Leibstandarte stood ready, scarred by its first combat, but far from defeated, preparing for the next great test of German military power. The Polish invasion established patterns and dynamics that would persist throughout the Leibstandarte's subsequent history. The unit had discovered a role that suited its particular characteristics: rapid exploitation of breakthrough, aggressive assault tactics, and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of operational objectives. It had also experienced for the first time the terrible cost of warfare, the reality that bullets and shells kill indiscriminately, and that ideology offered no protection against death. The Polish campaign had proven the Leibstandarte's utility as a combat formation, while simultaneously beginning a process of brutalization and radicalization that would intensify as the war progressed, particularly as the unit moved to the Eastern Front and encountered Soviet forces in a conflict understood by Nazi ideology as something far more than conventional military competition, as a civilizational and racial struggle. In the months following the Polish invasion, as Germany turned its attention westward toward France and Britain, the Leibstandarte would expand further, recruit more soldiers, acquire additional equipment, and prepare for larger challenges. The first taste of combat had left the unit stronger, more confident, and far more dangerous. The circle that had begun with Hitler's bodyguard had now, through fire and blood, become a true military instrument, ready to strike wherever the Nazi leadership directed it, carrying with it all the ambitions, ideologies, and contradictions of the regime it served. In the autumn of 1939, as the dust settled over the Polish campaigns and the Leibstandarte withdrew from the Eastern Front, a strange and uneven calm descended across continental Europe. The invasion of Poland had been swift and decisive, Yet it had also revealed gaps in the Leibstandarte's capacity as a combat force. The unit that emerged from Polish soil was no longer merely Hitler's bodyguard, no longer a regiment that could be sustained by ideology and reputation alone. It was a military organism that had tasted real warfare, absorbed real losses, and now stood at a crossroads between its ceremonial past and an uncertain military future. The men who returned were different from those who had marched across the Polish border weeks before, hardened by gunfire and the chaos of mobile warfare. Yet their numbers were thin, their equipment scattered, and their organizational structure straining under the weight of expansion. What unfolded over the following months would transform the Leibstandarte from an elite but limited unit into something far more ambitious, a full motorized division capable of sustained combat operations across multiple fronts. This transformation would require ruthless efficiency, unprecedented recruitment, and the wholesale rethinking of training, doctrine, and purpose. The wider context framed this reorganization with peculiar contradictions. Europe existed in a state of frozen conflict through the winter of 1939 and into 1940, a period the French would later call the drôle de guerre and the British the phony war, a name that captured the surreal tension of armies mobilized but not fully engaged. Germany, despite its apparent triumph in Poland, faced the reality of a two-front strategic nightmare. Britain remained unconquered across the Channel. France continued to mobilize behind the Maginot Line, and vast resources would be required to sustain both offensive capability and defensive posture along existing borders. The German High Command, meanwhile, was preparing for what they believed would be an inevitable clash with French and British forces, a conflict that would require heavier armor, more mobile forces, and the kind of rapid concentration of strength that only elite units could provide. The Leibstandarte's transformation was thus not merely an institutional choice, but a strategic necessity, born from planning for a conflict that seemed inevitable and imminent. Hitler himself took keen interest in the unit's expansion, viewing it as both a symbol of his personal authority and as a potential instrument of operational breakthrough when the moment came to strike westward. The reorganization was therefore not simply a military decision, but a political statement. The Führer was investing in his favorites, entrusting them with expanded authority and responsibility, and signaling to the German officer corps that loyalty to his person would be rewarded with resources and status. The recruitment process that began in late 1939 was unlike anything the Leibstandarte had experienced before. Previously, membership had been tightly controlled, with strict physical standards and ideological vetting that ensured a cohesive, unified body of believers. Now, with expansion from regiment to divisional strength, the selection criteria had to be broadened considerably, though not abandoned entirely. Young men with strong party affiliation, athletic builds, and demonstrated commitment to Nazi ideology remained the preferred material, but the Leibstandarte's recruiters were forced to cast a wider net as the demand for personnel accelerated. Posters appeared across Germany, emphasizing service in an elite unit with direct connection to the Führer, appealing to nationalist sentiment and the promise of distinction in coming battles. The SS apparatus worked in concert with the Wehrmacht and local party organizations to identify suitable candidates, and many volunteers came forward, drawn by the unit's reputation for aggressive action, its modern equipment, and the cachet of belonging to Hitler's own formation. Parallel to the voluntary recruitment, transfers from other Wehrmacht and SS units swelled the ranks, bringing with them varying degrees of military experience and ideological commitment. By the end of 1940, the Leibstandarte had expanded to roughly divisional strength, a transformation that had taken less than a year and had fundamentally altered its character from a select guard unit into something that began to resemble a conventional military formation, albeit one with peculiar political loyalties and ideological fervor. The training regimen that accompanied this expansion was intensive and carefully structured to balance military effectiveness with ideological reinforcement. Sepp Dietrich, the unit's commander, understood that raw manpower meant nothing without cohesion, discipline, and fighting capacity, and he oversaw a training program that was demanding by any standard. The curriculum encompassed small unit tactics, motorized infantry doctrine, coordination with armor and support elements, and the rigorous physical conditioning that had always characterized the Leibstandarte. Yet it also included renewed ideological instruction, lectures on the racial foundations of National Socialism, and repeated emphasis on the special nature of their mission as Hitler's personal soldiers. Officers and non-commissioned officers were screened carefully to ensure both military competence and political reliability, with the SS filling many command positions alongside Wehrmacht professionals who had volunteered or been transferred into the expanding unit. Training exercises grew larger and more complex, involving multiple companies, platoons working in coordination with armor and artillery, and increasingly ambitious operations that tested the unit's capacity to function as a division rather than a regiment. The contrast between the polished ceremonial soldiers who had stood guard at the Reich Chancellery just months before and the mud-covered men practicing assault tactics in training areas across Germany was stark and complete. This was not the transformation of an elite bodyguard into soldiers, but rather the creation of a military force that could claim elite status through demonstrated fighting capacity rather than mere ritual or proximity to power. Equipment modernization proceeded in parallel with recruitment and training, providing the Leibstandarte with the tools necessary to function as an autonomous motorized division. The unit began to receive motorized transport on a scale that would have seemed lavish just months before, with trucks, half-tracks, and armored personnel carriers flowing from German factories and allocated stocks. Tank strength was gradually increased, with the unit receiving modern Panzer tanks, including the Panzer III and later the heavier Panzer IV, weapons that represented the cutting edge of German armored technology in 1940. Machine guns, submachine guns, and anti-tank weapons were distributed in quantities appropriate to divisional structure, and specialized support elements including signals, reconnaissance, and engineer squads were organized and equipped. The contrast between the ceremonial unit of the previous decade and the increasingly formidable fighting machine taking shape across 1939 and 1940 was reflected not merely in manpower and training, but in the visible accumulation of hardware necessary to conduct sustained combat operations. Supply lines were established and tested, ammunition stocks were built up, and logistics systems were put in place to sustain operations at divisional scale. This expansion of capability was not without cost to other formations. The Leibstandarte's priority status meant that it received allocations that might otherwise have gone to Wehrmacht divisions, a reality that bred resentment among some regular military commanders and reinforced the special position the unit occupied within Germany's military hierarchy. Yet from a purely operational standpoint, the Leibstandarte was being equipped and trained to be a shock force capable of spearheading breakthrough operations when the order came to attack westward. The organizational restructuring that accompanied expansion required the creation of new command hierarchies and clarification of the unit's relationship to both the Wehrmacht and the SS. By late 1939 and through 1940, the Leibstandarte existed in a unique position, technically an SS formation under the control of the Reichsführer of the SS Heinrich Himmler, yet operationally subordinate to Wehrmacht commanders in military campaigns, and personally subject to Hitler's direct authority in matters of major strategic importance. This complex web of command relationships was managed through careful protocols and personalities who could navigate the competing demands of three different power structures. Sepp Dietrich's continued command was crucial to this arrangement, as he possessed sufficient military credibility to work with Wehrmacht leadership while maintaining absolute loyalty to Hitler and personal connections within the SS hierarchy. Below Dietrich, a divisional staff was organized and trained, bringing together officers experienced in coordinating large military formations with SS men, whose commitment to the Nazi cause was ideologically unquestionable. The structure that emerged was militarily functional, yet politically particular, designed to maximize the unit's fighting capacity, while preserving the political and personal bonds that had given it birth and sustained its existence. Regimental and battalion commanders were selected both for military competence and ideological conviction, with the result that the Leibstandarte represented a fusion of modern military science and totalitarian ideology in ways that conventional Wehrmacht units did not. Morale among the expanding ranks was complex and multifaceted, shaped by the convergence of multiple forces. The veterans of the Polish campaign enjoyed enhanced status and prestige, having proven themselves in combat and returned with stories of victory and decisive action. The newer recruits, particularly the ideologically committed volunteers who had chosen to join the Leibstandarte, brought energy and enthusiasm for service in an elite formation. The promise of expansion, the visibility of new equipment arriving, and the explicit priority status that the unit received all contributed to a sense of being part of something significant and favored. Yet, there were tensions beneath this surface confidence. The fusion of raw recruits with combat veterans created friction in some units. The pace of expansion sometimes outstripped the capacity of training systems to absorb new men efficiently, and the intense ideological emphasis could grate on some of the more professionally minded officers and men. The broader context of German society in late 1939 and 1940 was one of gathering apprehension about the looming conflict with France and Britain, and this underlying anxiety permeated even elite formations, despite the propaganda emphasizing German military superiority. The soldiers of the Leibstandarte were not immune to these currents of feeling, and while most accepted the coming conflict as inevitable and necessary, the knowledge that they would likely play a prominent role in the fighting to come created an undertone of tension beneath the visible confidence and morale. The relationship between the expanding Leibstandarte and the regular Wehrmacht during this period was delicate and evolving. Many Wehrmacht officers viewed the growth and increased autonomy of the Leibstandarte with suspicion, seeing it as a rival power center and potential challenge to the military's institutional prerogatives. The preferential treatment in equipment allocation, the direct relationship to Hitler that bypassed conventional chain of command, and the ideological distinctiveness of the unit created friction with the professional military establishment. Yet the Wehrmacht also recognized the Leibstandarte's growing military capability and understood that in the coming conflict with France and Britain, multiple units of proven reliability and aggressive spirit would be needed. Sepp Dietrich, despite his SS affiliation, worked to maintain functional relationships with Wehrmacht commanders, understanding that divisional-scale operations required coordination with other formations, and that excessive friction would be counterproductive. By early 1940, an accommodation had been reached, whereby the Leibstandarte would operate as a Wehrmacht unit in operational matters, while retaining its special political and personal relationship to Hitler, a formula that proved workable in practice despite the underlying tensions of divided loyalty. The final months of this phony war period saw the Leibstandarte positioned in the German Rhineland, ostensibly poised for the anticipated invasion of France, but in reality, continuing intensive training and preparation. Intelligence reports circulated through the German High Command suggested that the French and British remained unprepared for the scale and intensity of the German assault that was being planned, and there was a sense of impending action in the air. The Leibstandarte received briefings on potential operational areas, trained for crossing rivers and broken terrain, and began rehearsals for the kind of rapid mobile warfare that the German General Staff believed would be necessary to overcome French defenses. The ideological content of training intensified as well, with renewed emphasis on the racial and political purposes of the coming struggle, the necessity of German victory, and the role that elite formations like the Leibstandarte would play in determining the outcome. Equipment was inspected and re-inspected. Supply lines were stress-tested with large-scale logistics exercises, and officer training emphasized the coordination of forces across divisional and corps boundaries. There was a sense of anticipation that bordered on fatalism in some quarters. The men knew that they were being prepared for something large, knew that their unit would play a prominent role, and though many felt confidence in German military capability, there was also an awareness that the coming conflict with the Western powers represented a qualitatively different challenge than the swift campaign in Poland had been. By April 1940, the Leibstandarte had completed its transformation from a ceremonial guard unit into a motorized division ready for combat operations, and the waiting was nearly over. In the spring of 1940, Europe held its breath. For nearly 8 months, armies had stared across fortified lines in what observers called the phony war, a pause in the bloodshed that had begun when German tanks rolled into Poland. But that strange quiet was about to shatter. In the corridors of the Wehrmacht High Command, plans had been finalized for Operation Yellow, an invasion of France and the Low Countries that would fundamentally reshape the continent. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler now expanded far beyond its origins as a ceremonial bodyguard, stood poised to participate in this assault. No longer merely Hitler's shadow, the unit had become a spearhead, a division of several thousand men, equipped with tanks, artillery, and the ideological fervor that had transformed mere soldiers into true believers. For these men, the coming campaign represented something far more significant than conquest. It was vindication, proof that the system they served and the leader they worshipped possessed an almost supernatural capacity for victory. The invasion commenced on the 10th of May 1940, when German forces crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands with staggering force and precision. The Leibstandarte, as part of the Fourth Army, under General Gunther von Kluge, pushed forward with characteristic aggression. Unlike the regular Wehrmacht formations that operated according to strict doctrine and hierarchical procedure, the Leibstandarte had cultivated a culture of bold initiative and ruthless momentum. Their commanders encouraged rapid decision-making at lower levels. Junior officers and NCOs were empowered to push forward, to exploit gaps in enemy defenses, and to refuse the paralysis that sometimes gripped conventional military units. This approach, combined with superior coordination between armor, infantry, and supporting elements, proved devastatingly effective against defenders who were themselves struggling to concentrate their forces. The Belgian and Dutch armies, caught between the German onslaught in the east and the necessity of defending their own territories, crumbled within days. The Leibstandarte's role in this collapse was not marginal. They were among the spearhead units that crashed through initial defensive lines and raced toward the Channel coast. The unit's reputation for speed became almost legendary within those first days of the campaign. While some divisions struggled with supply lines, stretched across newly conquered terrain, or paused to consolidate positions, the Leibstandarte drove forward with an intensity that bordered on recklessness. Commanders understood that speed itself was a weapon. Every kilometer covered was a kilometer gained. Every day of rapid advance was a day during which the enemy couldn't regroup or form new defensive positions. The men of the division, many of them young and hardened by training that emphasized physical toughness and aggressive combat, responded to this pressure with a kind of possessed energy. They had been told repeatedly that they were the elite, that they belonged to Hitler's personal army, that they were inherently superior to their enemies. Propaganda and indoctrination, when reinforced by apparent military success, become intoxicating. In May 1940, every tactical victory seemed to confirm what their commanders and the regime had taught them, that they were destined to triumph, that their enemies were inferior, that history itself was on their side. As the Leibstandarte pushed deeper into Belgium and toward France, they encountered the first serious resistance. Belgian and then French forces attempted to establish defensive lines, hoping to slow the German advance long enough to allow Allied forces to consolidate a coordinated response. The Leibstandarte, however, showed little patience for methodical siege operations. Instead, they employed tactics that relied on concentrated force at the point of breakthrough. Heavy weapons companies would pound defensive positions with artillery and machine gun fire, creating suppressing fire that kept enemy defenders pinned. Meanwhile, assault platoons and company groups would maneuver around flanks or exploit gaps in the line, often operating with limited visibility and incomplete information about enemy positions. This kind of warfare demanded courage bordering on fearlessness, because soldiers moving through smoke and uncertainty toward entrenched positions faced the constant possibility of sudden death. Yet the Leibstandarte's men advanced, driving through Belgian positions with a ferocity that French and Belgian soldiers found overwhelming. The contrast between the Leibstandarte's operational tempo and that of conventional military units became increasingly apparent as the campaign unfolded. General Paul Reynaud, commanding French forces, and General Maurice Gamelin, the overall French military commander, found themselves unable to respond quickly enough to the speed and scale of the German advance. Plans that had assumed a campaign lasting months were rendered obsolete within days. By the middle of May, German forces had already crossed into France itself, racing toward the Channel to isolate the British Expeditionary Force and the northern French armies. The Leibstandarte participated in this wheeling movement, driving northwestward with a velocity that even other German units found difficult to match. Their supply lines stretched thin across conquered territory. Ammunition ran low at critical moments. Men were exhausted from days of continuous fighting and movement, yet they pressed forward, driven by orders from above and by the intoxication of victory. Prisoners taken in these early encounters reported not just military competence, but a kind of relentless hunger to advance, as though the men of the Leibstandarte were seized by something beyond normal military discipline. The encounter with British forces introduced a new element of resistance. The British Expeditionary Force, while smaller than the French armies and lacking the air superiority enjoyed by the Germans, possessed soldiers who were well trained and determined. When the Leibstandarte engaged British units near the Belgian-French border, they encountered a form of organized resistance that forced them to slow their advance, regroup, and apply greater force to achieve breakthroughs. These battles, though ultimately German victories, were bloodier than the engagements with Belgian or French forces. The Leibstandarte suffered their first significant casualties of the campaign. Men were killed, wounded, or captured. Yet even these losses, which would have slowed or halted conventional military formations, seemed to reinvigorate the Leibstandarte. Casualties confirmed that they were in combat, that they were proving themselves, that they were participating in something historically momentous. The dead and wounded became evidence of sacrifice, and within the worldview cultivated by Nazi ideology, sacrifice was ennobling. It bound survivors closer together, reinforced their sense of shared purpose, and deepened their identification with the unit and with the regime it served. By late May, the military situation in France had become catastrophic from the Allied perspective. The Leibstandarte, having fought their way through Belgium and into northern France, found themselves positioned to participate in the encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force and the northern French armies. German forces drove toward the Channel, seeking to cut off these forces from the south and from Britain. The Leibstandarte played a significant role in this maneuver, driving northwestward with aggressiveness that exploited the confusion and disorganization of Allied response. At Dunkirk, British forces were forced to evacuate across the Channel, escaping capture through hastily improvised operations. The Leibstandarte did not participate directly in the Dunkirk evacuation or the operations immediately surrounding it, but they were positioned nearby, and their rapid advance contributed to the crisis that necessitated the evacuation. The effect of this withdrawal, even though a substantial number of British troops escaped, was profound. The Leibstandarte had helped drive the British from the continent, achieved something that Napoleon and countless previous German generals had failed to accomplish. With the British forces withdrawn and the northern French armies encircled, the campaign entered its final phase. The Leibstandarte, along with other German formations, pivoted southward to finish the destruction of French military capability. Here, resistance often collapsed without substantial combat. French soldiers, facing overwhelming German military superiority, the encirclement and destruction of their northern armies, the occupation of vast swathes of their territory, and the apparent hopelessness of continuing the struggle, surrendered in growing numbers or simply abandoned their positions and fled southward. The Leibstandarte advanced through French territory with a speed that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Towns and cities fell without significant resistance. Vast quantities of equipment and supplies were captured. Thousands of prisoners were taken and processed, usually roughly, but without the systematic atrocities that would characterize German operations in the Soviet Union. By early June, organized French military resistance had effectively ceased. The rapidity of France's military collapse shocked observers worldwide. Military theorists had assumed that France, with its large army, its powerful fortifications, and its long military tradition, could resist German invasion for months or even years. Instead, France was militarily defeated in roughly 6 weeks. The Leibstandarte's role in this victory, while not the sole cause, was significant enough to enhance their reputation substantially. The unit had demonstrated that they could operate as a full division, not merely as an elite bodyguard. They had shown tactical competence, operational aggressiveness, and the capacity to coordinate complex operations involving armor, infantry, and supporting elements. More importantly, they had proven victorious in the field against well-equipped and professionally trained opponents. The psychological impact of this victory, both on the men of the Leibstandarte and on the broader German military and civilian population, was profound. Men who had been indoctrinated with beliefs in their own superiority now possessed concrete evidence of that superiority. The invincibility they had been taught to believe in seemed confirmed by events in the real world. Yet beneath the euphoria of victory, certain warning signs were already visible to those with eyes to see them. The Leibstandarte had suffered casualties, more than in Poland, though far fewer than they would eventually experience in Russia. Supply lines had proven difficult to maintain, and the campaign had revealed logistical weaknesses that would plague German operations for the remainder of the war. The speed of advance had occasionally left units isolated or exposed to flanking counterattacks, circumstances that succeeded only because French responses were uncoordinated and ultimately ineffective. Most significantly, the campaign had demonstrated the limitations of the blitzkrieg strategy when applied against opponents with greater geographical depth and resources. Germany had defeated France militarily, but the industrial capacity and resources of the Soviet Union and the United States remained largely untouched. The Leibstandarte stood in triumph in June 1940, believing themselves invincible, unaware that within a year they would face challenges in Russia that would make the conquest of France seem almost like a rehearsal for something far more terrible. The victory over France transformed the Leibstandarte in ways that extended far beyond military reputation. Within the Nazi hierarchy, the unit's success elevated their status even further. Hitler himself took personal pride in the performance of his Guard unit, viewing it as validation of both his military judgment and his ideological vision. Recruitment intensified. Men from across Germany and from territories under German control volunteered or were conscripted into Leibstandarte formations, hoping to join a unit that had proven victorious. Training expanded to accommodate the influx of new soldiers, and the unit began its transformation from a division into a much larger force. Veterans of the French campaign, men who had experienced combat and proven themselves capable, became training cadres for the new recruits. Yet with this expansion came subtle changes. The unit was becoming less the personal bodyguard of Hitler and more a premier combat formation, a kind of elite branch of the SS military. It would retain Hitler's name and the ideological symbolism that accompanied it, but increasingly, it would function as an instrument of warfare rather than personal protection. The months following the French victory were marked by a sense of unreality for much of Germany. The war that was supposed to last for years had been effectively won in Western Europe. The Leibstandarte returned to occupied France for rest and reorganization, receiving new equipment, fresh supplies, and an endless stream of new recruits. The men were celebrated as heroes, displayed in propaganda newsreels, and honored in ways that reinforced their sense of being part of something special and historically significant. But even as they celebrated, plans were being finalized for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had always intended for Germany to attack eastward eventually, and the unexpected swiftness of victory in France convinced him that the moment had arrived to strike at the Soviet Union before consolidating his position in Western Europe. The Leibstandarte, having proven themselves in combat, would be fundamental to this new venture. The unit that had served as Hitler's shadow since the 1920s, that had evolved into a military formation, and that had just achieved stunning victory in France, would now be thrust into a conflict far more vast, far more brutal, and far less susceptible to rapid conclusion than anything they had yet experienced. By early June 1940, the campaign in France had entered its final phase, and the Leibstandarte stood at the threshold of a victory that would reshape the entire character of the Nazi regime. The French army, once regarded as the finest military force in continental Europe, lay shattered across the world of northern France. German forces had penetrated deep into French territory, and the question was no longer whether France would fall, but how quickly the collapse would be complete. The Leibstandarte, positioned within the Army Group A, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, found itself in precisely the role that its leadership had trained for: the exploitation of breakthrough and the relentless pursuit of a disintegrating enemy. Sepp Dietrich, commanding the division with uncompromising aggression, drove his men forward, through a landscape already transformed by weeks of combat. The unit had evolved from a ceremonial bodyguard into a genuine instrument of war, and this final phase of the French campaign would cement that transformation in the minds of the German High Command and, more importantly, in Hitler's own strategic calculations. The path to the final German victory had not been entirely without friction or difficulty. The Leibstandarte, like all German forces, had encountered resistance that demanded respect, particularly in the opening phases of Operation Yellow. British and French forces had offered determined stands at key points, and the campaign had been far from a bloodless, triumphal march. However, the fundamental disparity in tactical coordination, speed of maneuver, and willingness to accept risk had accumulated into an overwhelming German advantage. By early June, the French government was disintegrating. The High Command was fracturing into competing factions, and the very question of continued resistance seemed almost academic. The Leibstandarte's role in these final weeks was to drive deeper into French territory, to capture key positions ahead of the main German army, and to prevent any organized retreat or reconcentration of French forces. The speed of German advance had become the defining characteristic of the campaign, and the Leibstandarte embodied that speed with almost reckless determination. One of the most significant operations in this final phase involved the Leibstandarte's drive toward the Loire Valley and the ports along the Atlantic coast. The unit, operating as part of the larger German advance, pushed south and westward, with minimal pause for consolidation or supply. The landscape changed as they moved deeper into France. The industrial regions of the north gave way to agricultural areas, and then to the more densely forested terrain of central France. German intelligence indicated that isolated French forces and hastily assembled defensive lines remained in scattered locations, but these were increasingly disorganized and lacking in coordination with any central command structure. The Leibstandarte encountered and overwhelmed these resistance pockets with an efficiency that spoke to their training and morale. Officers and men alike understood that the campaign was won, and that what remained was simply the formal conclusion of what had already been decided by superior German strategy and execution. This psychological factor, the certainty of ultimate victory, had its own military value, translating into aggressive movement and bold tactical decisions. The relationship between the Leibstandarte and the regular Wehrmacht during these final phases deserves careful consideration. From the beginning of the French campaign, a subtle but significant tension had existed between Hitler's elite guard division and the conventional army hierarchy. The Leibstandarte answered directly to Hitler through its leadership, while Wehrmacht formations answered through the standard chain of command. This created occasional coordination challenges, and, more importantly, a degree of competition for recognition and resources. By June, as the campaign neared its end, this tension had not disappeared, but had been largely subsumed into a shared sense of triumph. The Leibstandarte's performance during the campaign had been noted by the High Command. The unit had sustained relatively high casualties by virtue of its aggressive tactics, but it had also consistently achieved its objectives and maintained its fighting capability even under stress. This balance between aggression and cohesion had not gone unnoticed, and conversations in the highest levels of the German command structure increasingly included discussions of how the Leibstandarte might be rewarded and expanded once the war was formally concluded. As June progressed toward the end of the month, the formal surrender negotiations and armistice procedures began to dominate military operations. The Leibstandarte, like other frontline units, received orders to consolidate positions and prepare for a potential transition to occupation duties. The atmosphere within the division was one of triumph, mixed with a certain bemusement at how quickly and completely the French collapse had occurred. Veteran soldiers, men who had fought through Poland and the Low Countries, found themselves in the surreal position of occupying a European nation without facing the level of resistance that many had anticipated. The French government, under Marshal Philippe Pétain, agreed to German terms, and on the 22nd of June 1940, an armistice was signed. This date would become one of the most celebrated in Nazi Germany, marking the moment when German military superiority had been vindicated against the traditional enemy that had defeated Germany in the previous war. For the Leibstandarte, this moment carried particular significance. They were no longer simply Hitler's bodyguard, but had proven themselves as a division-strength combat force capable of competing with and decisively defeating any comparable enemy formation. The return of the Leibstandarte to German territory in the weeks following the French armistice was marked by ceremonial parades and public recognition that elevated the unit's status even further. Sepp Dietrich and other senior commanders received decorations and promotions, cementing their positions within the Nazi power structure. The Leibstandarte's casualties during the entire campaign, from May through June, had been significant, but not catastrophic, a reflection of their aggressive tactics balanced against the generally rapid collapse of French resistance. The unit had lost officers and men who had fought alongside their comrades since the earliest days of the Nazi regime, and these losses were mourned within the division, even as the overall victory was celebrated. However, the strategic calculation was clear. The Leibstandarte had proven its worth as a combat formation, and the Nazi regime's investment in this elite division had been repaid in military success. The symbolic value of this victory, the defeat of France, the avenging of 1918, the demonstration of German military supremacy, cannot be overstated in understanding how the Leibstandarte's position was transformed. The political implications of the Leibstandarte's successful campaign extended well beyond military considerations. Within the Nazi regime, the SS had always occupied a complex position, serving simultaneously as the regime's ideological vanguard and as a paramilitary organization outside the regular state structures. The Leibstandarte, as the most elite and visible component of the SS, had always held a particular place within this hierarchy. By proving that SS formations could compete with and surpass Wehrmacht divisions in conventional military operations, the Leibstandarte had strengthened the SS's claim to expanded military responsibilities. Hitler, who harbored deep skepticism about the traditional officer corps of the Wehrmacht, was increasingly drawn to the idea of expanding SS military formations as a counterweight to conventional army authority. The successful campaign in France provided concrete evidence that this approach was militarily sound, not merely ideologically satisfying. Conversations and planning that would eventually lead to the expansion of the entire Waffen-SS began in earnest during the summer of 1940, in the wake of the Leibstandarte's triumph. The immediate aftermath of the French victory also witnessed significant changes in the Leibstandarte's internal structure and recruitment policies. The division, having proven itself in combat, was granted expanded authority to recruit new members and to expand its ranks to divisional strength. The criteria for membership, always stringent, were refined but not fundamentally altered. Ideological commitment remained paramount, but combat experience and demonstrated capability now joined racial purity and party loyalty as selection criteria. Officers who had proven themselves during the campaign were promoted and given command of expanded formations. Enlisted men who had distinguished themselves received advancement and were often assigned to train incoming recruits in the tactics and standards that had proven successful in France and Belgium. The atmosphere within the division during this period combined celebration of victory with intense focus on preparation for whatever conflict might come next. Few soldiers, at this stage, harbored doubts about eventual German victory in any confrontation with remaining enemies. The ease with which France had been defeated suggested that German military superiority was now established beyond question. The logistical and material consequences of the French victory also transformed the Leibstandarte's position within the broader German military apparatus. The capture of French territory and material resources provided the German war economy with significant new capacity and resources. The Leibstandarte, as Hitler's premier division, received priority access to captured equipment, newly manufactured weapons, and the most advanced military technology available. German engineers and designers, understanding Hitler's particular regard for the Leibstandarte, often directed new weapon systems and tactical innovations toward this formation as a means of demonstrating their capabilities to the regime's leadership. The division that had fought in France with a mix of captured Czech and German equipment would return to its garrison with the opportunity to re-equip with the latest available weapons. This material advantage would accumulate over time, creating an ever-widening gap between the Leibstandarte and other military formations, both within the SS and within the regular Wehrmacht. The relationship between the Leibstandarte's triumph and Hitler's own strategic ambitions deserves particular attention. The Führer, watching from his headquarters in the aftermath of the French collapse, saw in the Leibstandarte's performance validation of his own strategic vision and military judgment. Hitler had insisted on aggressive tactics and rapid maneuver throughout the campaign, and the success of these approaches reinforced his confidence in his own strategic insight. The Leibstandarte, more than any other formation, had embodied this aggressive approach, and the division's success became, in Hitler's mind, proof of the correctness of his own strategic direction. This created a reinforcing cycle. Hitler became increasingly convinced of his own military genius. The Leibstandarte became the favored instrument through which this genius would be expressed, and the division received ever-increasing resources and authority. The political consequences of this dynamic would unfold over the next several years, shaping not only the Leibstandarte's role in future campaigns, but also the broader trajectory of Nazi Germany's military strategy. The symbolic significance of the Leibstandarte's presence in the victory parades and public celebrations that marked the French collapse cannot be overlooked. The division, parading through German cities in full battle dress, receiving the acclamation of the German population, represented the triumph of Nazi ideology made manifest in military form. Young men watching these parades understood the message being conveyed. The Leibstandarte represented the future of German military power, the embodiment of racial superiority and ideological purity combined with military effectiveness. Recruitment for the division accelerated dramatically in the months following the French victory, as young men sought to join what appeared to be the most successful and prestigious military formation in the German state. The narrative of the Leibstandarte, from Hitler's personal bodyguard to elite combat division to instrument of German triumph, became a central element of Nazi propaganda and popular mythology. This narrative would sustain the division through the trials that lay ahead, maintaining morale even when military circumstances became progressively more desperate. By the end of June 1940, the Leibstandarte had been transformed from what it had been at the beginning of May, no longer primarily a ceremonial or police force, but an established military division with a proven combat record. The unit was garrisoned in Germany, incorporating new recruits and beginning training for whatever conflict might follow. The memory of the French campaign, the ease of the victory, and the recognition that had followed would shape the division's self-perception for years to come. Sepp Dietrich and his officers understood that they had achieved something extraordinary. They had proven that an elite formation could be forged from political commitment and ideological unity into a military instrument that could compete with and defeat conventional military formations. This success would carry consequences that extended far beyond the division itself, influencing not only the structure and strategy of the Nazi war machine, but also the very character and trajectory of the German war effort that was only now beginning. The Leibstandarte's moment of triumph in the summer of 1940 was not an ending, but a beginning, the point from which a much longer and far more destructive conflict would emerge. Victory in France had granted the Leibstandarte something it had never truly possessed before: legitimacy. The unit that had begun as street muscle and evolved into Hitler's ceremonial guard had now proven itself on the battlefield. Officers and men alike returned from the campaign of 1940 wearing a new authority. The Wehrmacht hierarchy, which had often regarded these Nazi paramilitary soldiers with suspicion and disdain, was forced to acknowledge their combat effectiveness. Yet this moment of triumph carried within it the seeds of something far more consequential. As the summer of 1940 settled across Germany, Hitler was already turning his gaze eastward, toward the Soviet Union. The victory in France was never intended as a conclusion, but merely an intermission. The true test of Nazi ideology, Hitler believed, lay in the vast territories of Eastern Europe and Russia, and the Leibstandarte, no longer a curiosity, but a proven instrument of war, would be at the forefront of this enormous undertaking. The planning for Operation Barbarossa began in secret, even as German forces were still mopping up French resistance. Within the upper echelons of the Nazi leadership and the Wehrmacht High Command, the decision had been made. Soviet Russia represented both the ideological enemy and the territorial prize that would sustain German dominion for generations. From the perspective of the regime, the Leibstandarte could not be excluded from this grand design. Sepp Dietrich, now commanding the unit with the rank of Brigadeführer, recognized that Barbarossa would demand a transformation of unprecedented scale. The Leibstandarte had grown from a few hundred bodyguards into a regiment of several thousand. To participate meaningfully in the invasion of the Soviet Union, it would need to become something larger still, a full motorized division capable of independent operations across the vast Russian landscape. This expansion would not be a gradual affair, managed over years. Instead, recruitment and reorganization accelerated at a pace that reflected the urgency of the regime's ambitions and the timeline Hitler had imposed upon his military planners. The recruitment drive that followed was remarkable in its scope and intensity. The Leibstandarte, previously selective and rigorous in its membership standards, opened its ranks to an unprecedented influx of personnel. Young men across Germany were encouraged to volunteer for this elite unit, and propaganda promised them glory, advancement, and a place in the vanguard of history. The Hitler Youth movement provided a steady stream of candidates, many of them barely past adolescence, indoctrinated since childhood in Nazi ideology, and eager to prove themselves in service to the regime. Officers conducted tours, held rallies, and distributed materials that painted service in the Leibstandarte as the highest honor a German could achieve. The response was overwhelming. By the end of 1940, the unit had expanded to more than 6,000 men. By early 1941, that number had swelled to nearly twice that magnitude. This rapid growth created both opportunity and strain. The challenge of maintaining cohesion, discipline, and the unit's distinctive identity while absorbing so many newcomers fell upon a cadre of veterans who had learned their trade in Poland and France. The training regimen that accompanied this expansion was brutal and unrelenting. Existing facilities near Berlin proved inadequate for the scale of preparation now required. The Leibstandarte established multiple training camps across German territory, with concentrations in areas that could simulate the terrain and conditions they would encounter in Russia. Officers pushed recruits through endless cycles of weapons training, small unit tactics, and vehicular operations. The emphasis was on speed and aggression. The doctrine of blitzkrieg, translated into tactical practice, meant that individual soldiers and crews had to internalize rapid decision-making under pressure. Marching drills were combined with live fire exercises. Drivers trained on captured vehicles and new German designs. Tank crews rehearsed coordinated movements and fire discipline. The training was designed not merely to produce competent soldiers, but to forge a unified body, moving with predetermined purpose. This was not the militia training of citizen soldiers. This was the construction of a professional military instrument, optimized for offensive warfare and rapid maneuver. The physical demands were immense, and the psychological pressure was equally intense. Parallel to the military training ran an ideological indoctrination, more comprehensive and systematic than anything the Leibstandarte had previously undertaken. As the unit expanded and absorbed recruits from across Germany and German-occupied territories, there was a conscious effort to ensure that every man understood not merely how to fight, but why. Political officers attached to the Leibstandarte conducted regular sessions exploring Nazi racial theory, the concept of Lebensraum, and the justification for German expansion into Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was presented not simply as a military adversary, but as a racial and ideological enemy, fundamentally incompatible with German civilization. Recruits were taught that the coming campaign was not a conventional war, but a struggle for survival and racial supremacy. The Bolsheviks, the lectures insisted, represented a Jewish conspiracy aimed at the destruction of German culture and the Aryan race. These sessions were interspersed throughout the training day, reinforcing the message that military skill and ideological conviction were inseparable. Officers understood that conscripting young men into lethal combat required more than promises of advancement or appeals to patriotism. It required a complete internalization of a worldview that made the killing of Soviet soldiers and civilians not merely permissible, but morally justified. The material transformation of the Leibstandarte during this period was equally significant. The unit that had fought in France as primarily an infantry formation with attached armor and support elements now began receiving modern equipment at an accelerated rate. New tank models, including the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were allocated to the Leibstandarte's growing armored component. Motorized transport expanded, allowing the division to maintain the mobility that blitzkrieg doctrine demanded. Artillery pieces, including the deadly 88mm anti-aircraft gun that could be repurposed for anti-tank defense, were integrated into the unit's structure. Communications equipment was upgraded, allowing for faster coordination between dispersed elements. The Leibstandarte received priority access to new weapons and technologies, a reflection of its status within the Nazi military hierarchy. The men of the Leibstandarte believed themselves equipped to face any enemy and overcome any obstacle. This confidence would sustain them through the initial phases of Barbarossa, but would prove catastrophically misaligned with the realities they would encounter. The strategic conception underlying this enormous military buildup was itself remarkable in its scope and ambition. Hitler envisioned the invasion of the Soviet Union not as a limited campaign with defined objectives, but as a war of annihilation. The vast territories of Russia and Ukraine would be conquered, their resources exploited, and their populations subjugated or displaced. The Leibstandarte, as Hitler's personal military instrument and the exemplar of Nazi military values, would play a central role in this transformation of the Eastern European map. Senior commanders within the Wehrmacht, including many who harbored deep doubts about the political regime, accepted the operational parameters. The coming campaign would be unprecedented in scale and brutality. They understood, whether they acknowledged it or not, that this was not a war fought according to traditional rules. The Commissariat order and subsequent directives made clear that Soviet political officers would be executed, that partisan activity would be suppressed with overwhelming force, and that the civilian population would be regarded as a hostile entity. For the Leibstandarte, trained since its inception to subordinate individual moral judgment to the will of Hitler and the demands of the organization, these directives posed no philosophical obstacle. The unit had already crossed thresholds that would be unthinkable to conventional military formations. By the spring of 1941, the transformation was nearly complete. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had evolved from the personal bodyguard of a dictator into a full motorized division of the German army, numbering more than 19,000 officers and men. The divisional structure included multiple panzer companies, motorized infantry battalions, artillery regiments, and support formations. The unit was capable of sustained independent operations across vast distances. Equipment was modern and well-maintained. Men were trained intensively in their specialties. Officers possessed combat experience from the Polish and French campaigns and had spent months preparing for the different demands of warfare in Russia. The ideological commitment of the personnel ranged from fanatical to professional, but all understood the cause they were meant to serve. The Leibstandarte was no longer a peculiar Nazi institution that the traditional military viewed with condescension. It was, by any objective measure, a first-rate combat formation. In meetings of senior commanders, Hitler spoke with particular pride of this unit. It would, he assured his generals, prove decisive in the coming campaign. The confidence was absolute, and in the spring of 1941, the confidence seemed justified. Yet beneath this impressive exterior, there were tensions and contradictions that would become increasingly apparent as the campaign unfolded. The rapid expansion had necessarily diluted the selectivity that had previously defined membership in the Leibstandarte. Some recruits, particularly those conscripted from the Waffen-SS or transferred from other units, did not possess the ideological fervor or personal connection to the regime that characterized the original cadre. Training could be accelerated, but unit cohesion and the intangible bonds that held elite formations together required time and shared experience. The emphasis on ideological indoctrination was partly an acknowledgement of this vulnerability. By impressing upon every man the righteousness of the cause and the necessity of total commitment, the leadership hoped to bind the division together through shared conviction, if not yet through proven trust in battle. The equipment, while modern, had not yet been tested against Soviet armor in large-scale combat. The doctrine of blitzkrieg had proven devastatingly effective against France and Poland, but the Soviet Union presented different challenges: greater distances, different terrain, and an adversary with armor and numbers that German planners had to regard with serious concern. These doubts, however, were expressed privately among senior commanders, never allowed within the Leibstandarte itself. The cultural atmosphere within the division during these months of preparation was one of anticipation mixed with barely suppressed anxiety. Soldiers wrote letters home, expressing confidence in their superiority and faith in the righteousness of the cause. Yet there was also a recognition that the coming campaign would be unlike anything they had yet experienced. The Soviet Union was not France, defeated and exhausted. It was a vast continental power, with seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower and material. Rumor mills within the division circulated stories about Soviet armor, about the brutality of Russian soldiers, about the vast distances and harsh climate of Eastern Europe. Officers addressed these concerns by emphasizing the superiority of German training, equipment, and leadership. The coming victory was assured, they insisted, if every man performed his duty with courage and discipline. Yet the tone of these assurances carried a hint of defensiveness, as if the commanders themselves recognized that what lay ahead would test their formations in ways that France had not. By June of 1941, the Leibstandarte was assembled and ready. The vehicles were fueled, the weapons were loaded, the men were positioned along the frontier. The massive machinery of German invasion was prepared to crush its greatest enemy. The division that had been born from Hitler's need for personal protection had become the instrument through which he hoped to reshape the world. In the coming weeks and months, it would discover whether preparation, equipment, ideology, and confidence could overcome the realities of warfare on the Russian steppes. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 22nd of June, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Among them, traveling with Army Group Center toward Moscow, was the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. For this unit, the invasion represented a fundamental transformation. What had been urban combat in Poland and rapid mechanized warfare in France now gave way to something far more vast and unforgiving. The steppes stretched beyond comprehension, a landscape that swallowed armies whole. The Leibstandarte, numbering around 8,500 men at the invasion's start, moved forward into an expanse where distance itself became an enemy as lethal as any opposing force. They were elite, ideologically hardened, and confident. They were also, in the immensity of Russia, merely one small instrument among many in Hitler's grand machine. The initial advance moved with stunning velocity. Soviet forces, caught partially unprepared despite intelligence warnings, retreated in disarray across vast territories. The Leibstandarte, equipped with modern tanks and operating as part of the mechanized Spearhead, advanced sometimes 60 kilometers in a single day. Villages fell in sequence, their names unfamiliar to German tongues, their strategic value often nominal, but their occupation necessary for forward momentum. The unit's combat doctrine emphasized rapid strikes and exploitation of enemy weakness. Officers pushed men relentlessly forward, demanding maximum exertion in pursuit of a Soviet army seemingly in collapse. Intelligence reports spoke of encirclement, of vast Soviet formations trapped and about to surrender. The confidence among German command was almost intoxicating. Many soldiers, including those in the Leibstandarte, believed the campaign would conclude by autumn, with Moscow falling and the Soviet state broken before winter could establish its grip. But the Soviet Union's geography and resources proved deceptive. For every Soviet division destroyed or captured, another appeared from the depths of the Russian interior. The Red Army fell back, yes, but it did not disintegrate. Stalin, brutal and ruthless, moved entire industries eastward, beyond the reach of German air power. He mobilized the vast populations of the interior, drawing forth reservists and new conscripts by the hundreds of thousands. The Leibstandarte advanced deeper into this moor, and the supply lines stretched ever thinner. Trucks broke down on primitive roads that dissolved into mud with the onset of rain. Food supplies diminished, Ammunition had to be rationed. The clarity of the initial campaign, with its defined objectives and rapid victories, gave way to a grinding, attritional nightmare. By July and August, the nature of the fighting had transformed entirely. Soviet counterattacks, poorly coordinated at times but increasingly desperate and ferocious, struck at German positions with suicidal determination. The Leibstandarte encountered tank brigades that seemed to emerge from nowhere, throwing themselves against German lines in waves. Soviet anti-tank guns, often crewed by soldiers with only days of training, nevertheless inflicted casualties. The unit's losses mounted. Men killed in action, men wounded so severely they never returned to duty, replacements arriving from Germany who lacked the training and experience of the fallen. The Leibstandarte's commander, Sepp Dietrich, drove the men forward relentlessly, committed to every offensive thrust, every reconnaissance probe, every holding action that high command demanded. The unit gained notoriety among both German forces and Soviet defenders as a formation that would attack when others hesitated, would hold ground when others retreated, and would absorb punishment that seemed beyond the tolerance of ordinary soldiers. The autumn of 1941 brought no relief. Instead, it brought a different horror. The weather turned. Summer heat gave way to cold rain, then sleet, then snow. Temperatures plummeted. Men wearing summer uniforms, for no one had anticipated that the campaign would extend into November, suffered frostbite and exposure. Horses died by the thousands, frozen in place or shot when they could no longer move, their carcasses left to freeze in the Russian landscape. The Leibstandarte lacked adequate winter equipment, as did most German forces. Supply depots in Germany had never been designed to sustain 3 million soldiers on the steppes through a Russian winter. Hunger accompanied cold. Rations diminished further. The morale that had been so robust at the invasion's outset now curdled into a grim, exhausted determination simply to survive another day. The Leibstandarte's reputation nonetheless solidified during this period. Soviet commanders, monitoring German dispositions, noted that the Leibstandarte appeared in the most critical sectors, often rotating between different army groups to shore up threatened positions. The unit fought at Smolensk in brutal urban combat. It participated in the encirclement operations that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. It advanced toward Moscow as part of Army Group Center's final desperate thrust in November and December 1941. The unit paid a ferocious price for this prominence. Casualty rates within the Leibstandarte exceeded those of regular Wehrmacht divisions. Officers fell regularly. Experienced non-commissioned officers were killed or permanently disabled. The ideological bond that held the unit together, the absolute commitment to Hitler and the Nazi cause, became the only thing that kept men advancing when reason suggested withdrawal, when survival suggested surrender. By December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive struck Army Group Center with overwhelming force. Stalin, having concentrated reserves, launched attacks designed not merely to halt the German advance, but to destroy the Wehrmacht entirely. The Leibstandarte found itself fighting a two-front war, no longer advancing but defending against massive Soviet thrusts. The unit held ground with ferocious determination, committing every remaining soldier to holding positions that often seemed indefensible. Tank crews fought their vehicles to destruction rather than abandoning them. Infantry units, reduced to company strength, held sectors designed for battalion defense. The Leibstandarte did not break. It gave ground slowly, desperately, but it did not disintegrate. The Soviet offensive, ultimately, lacked the resources to achieve the decisive breakthrough it sought. and the front stabilized along a ragged line that stretched across western Russia. What emerged from this catastrophic campaign was a transformed Leibstandarte. The unit had entered Russia as an elite formation of around 8,500 men, many of them veterans of France and Poland, all of them politically selected and ideologically screened. By the campaign's first winter, it had suffered more than 2,000 casualties. Replacements arrived, but they lacked the selection criteria and indoctrination of the original members. The unit reorganized and expanded, transforming from a regiment into divisional strength, growing to around 15,000 men by early 1942. These new soldiers came from various backgrounds, many conscripted rather than volunteered. Their ideological commitment variable, yet the core remained. The officers and senior non-commissioned officers who survived carried with them the hardness that Russia had forged. They had seen the Red Army close at hand, understood its resilience and ferocity, and had learned that this war would not be brief. The Leibstandarte's performance in Russia established it as Hitler's preeminent military formation. Despite horrific losses, it had never surrendered terrain, except when ordered to do so. It had inflicted enormous casualties on Soviet forces. It had earned the grudging respect of Wehrmacht commanders and the genuine fear of Soviet commanders who knew that the Leibstandarte would be committed to the most critical moments. The unit's reputation for aggression was well-founded, but this aggression was increasingly desperate rather than triumphant. Men fought with the knowledge that retreat meant death, that surrender was not an option for members of Hitler's personal guard, that the only path forward lay through blood and endurance. The ideology that had bound them in Berlin and Paris now manifested as a willingness to absorb any punishment, accept any sacrifice, in service to a cause that was already, though most did not yet comprehend it, already lost. The Leibstandarte's experience in Russia from 1941 through 1943 was not one of conquest and triumph, though it remained a formidable fighting force. It was instead an experience of attrition, of learning that even elite formations could be worn down by weight of numbers and vast geography. The Soviet Union did not yield as France had yielded. It did not collapse as Poland had collapsed. Instead, it absorbed invasion, suffered catastrophic losses, and then, through ruthless mobilization and inexhaustible reserves, turned the tables on the invader. The Leibstandarte adapted to this reality with remarkable resilience, but the cost was immense. Each Soviet winter took more men, more vehicles, more equipment. Each offensive operation brought fresh casualties among the irreplaceable officer corps. The unit that would later fight at Kursk would defend Normandy and would make the final desperate stand in the Ardennes was forged in the horror of the Russian steppes, hardened by an enemy that refused to break, shaped by a war that demanded ever more sacrifice from those committed to it. By the campaign's conclusion in 1942, the Leibstandarte had ceased to exist as it had been at the invasion's start. The original formation, hand-selected and ideologically vetted, had been largely destroyed and replaced with conscripts and volunteers of varying quality. The unit remained elite by Nazi standards, receiving better equipment and training than ordinary formations, enjoying special status within the Wehrmacht hierarchy. Yet something had been fundamentally altered. The men now understood viscerally what the Soviet Union represented. Not a nation that could be conquered in weeks, but an existential opponent that would grind the Wehrmacht down through sheer persistence and relentless counteroffense. The Leibstandarte would continue to fight, continue to advance, and continue to hold ground with desperate determination. But the confidence that had characterized the invasion's opening weeks had evaporated into the snow and frozen earth of the Russian winter, replaced by a grim awareness that the war had become something far darker than what the ideologues and planners in Berlin had promised. The Eastern Front was a war unto itself. While Western Europe had known invasion and occupation measured in months, Russia presented a different geometry of conflict entirely. Here, space and time operated by their own brutal mathematics. Armies moved across distances that dwarfed entire nations. Seasons transformed landscape into weapon, and the very concept of a front line dissolved into something far more ambiguous and lethal. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler entered this realm in the summer of 1941, and for the next 30 months, it would become fundamentally transformed by what it encountered there. What had been a politically motivated police force, then a successful conventional military unit, would emerge from Russian soil, something altogether harder and more savage. The men who survived would carry with them scars that no surgeon could address. The initial invasion, during Operation Barbarossa, had promised rapid victory. German commanders believed that a decisive campaign lasting only months would crush Soviet resistance before winter arrived. The Leibstandarte, positioned within the massive invasion force, shared in this optimism. Officers issued orders with the certainty of men who expected to dictate terms in Moscow by September. Supply lines were organized on the assumption of swift advance. Equipment was maintained with the expectation that the war in Russia would be brief and concluding. These assumptions dissolved almost immediately upon contact with reality. The Soviet Union did not collapse as projected. Its army, despite catastrophic initial losses, retreated into the vastness and continued to fight. Soviet strategy became one of yielding ground while preserving force, accepting enormous territorial losses while buying time for winter and preparing for counteroffensive operations. Against this patient, grinding resistance, German assumptions about quick victory became hollow and then dangerous. The Leibstandarte's experience in 1942 began to establish patterns that would define the next 2 years. The unit participated in offensives that achieved tactical success, but failed to produce strategic breakthrough. It advanced hundreds of kilometers, only to find itself bogged down in positional warfare. Supply shortages began to bite deeper as the vast distances from Germany accumulated. Replacements arrived, but they came as individual reinforcements rather than cohesive units, and new men struggled to integrate into a formation that had begun to develop its own hardened culture. Casualties mounted with each passing month. Wounded men were evacuated back toward Germany, but the pace of replacement could never quite keep up with the pace of loss. Combat units that should have contained 800 men operated with 600. Platoons fell below 50 men. Officers learned to fight lean formations and to extract maximum combat effect from diminishing resources. The mathematics of attrition began their slow, inexorable work. Winter came, as it always did to Russia, but German forces had not prepared for it as they should have. The Leibstandarte, like all German units on the Eastern Front, discovered that conventional winter equipment was inadequate for temperatures that fell beyond anything most men had ever experienced. Engines froze. Lubricants became solid. Leather became brittle and cracked. Men suffered frostbite that cost them fingers, toes, and noses. The cold killed as surely as bullets, though more slowly. Food supplies froze solid and became inedible. The line between survival and death narrowed daily. And yet, the Leibstandarte continued to fight. Soviet counteroffensives pressed from multiple directions. German forces had to maintain defensive positions without adequate numbers or supplies. Men rotated through guard duties in conditions that seemed designed by nature to extract maximum suffering. Many soldiers developed what military physicians termed exhaustion, a condition that combined frostbite, malnutrition, and psychological collapse into something that looked less like an illness than like the human body's simple refusal to continue. Survivors of that winter would carry memory of it for the rest of their lives. By 1942, the ideological character of the conflict had hardened considerably. The Leibstandarte had arrived in Russia with conventional military attitudes. War was war, and soldiers were soldiers. These assumptions began to erode almost immediately. Soviet soldiers fought with a determination that German commanders interpreted as fanaticism rather than patriotism. Their willingness to die rather than surrender perplexed German officers accustomed to enemies who accepted conventional military logic. Nazi ideology had prepared the Leibstandarte's men to view Slavic peoples as inferior, but the evidence before them suggested something different. Propaganda ministries attempted to explain the contradiction by doubling down on racial ideology, by insisting that Soviet soldiers were fighting not from choice, but from terror imposed by communist leadership. This narrative provided psychological comfort, but also served another purpose. It justified increasingly harsh treatment of prisoners and of conquered populations. The Leibstandarte, like other SS formations, began to participate in actions that moved beyond conventional military operations into something darker and more systematic. The unit's recruitment expanded dramatically through 1942 and into 1943. The initial Leibstandarte had drawn members from across Germany, selected according to stringent racial and political criteria. As casualties mounted and expansion continued, recruitment standards relaxed somewhat, though racial and ideological requirements remained paramount. The unit began to accept ethnic Germans from occupied territories and from allied nations. Croatians, Romanians, Hungarians, and other nationalities joined the formation. Some were volunteers who believed in the Nazi cause. Others saw military service as preferable to alternative fates or as a path to advancement. The result was a unit that became increasingly multinational while remaining firmly committed to Nazi ideology at its leadership level. This created internal tensions. The shared trauma of fighting in Russia created bonds between men, but these bonds had to accommodate significant cultural and linguistic differences. Officers worked to maintain unit cohesion through rigorous training and emphasis on shared identity as members of an elite formation. The ideology of the Leibstandarte became almost a substitute for national identity. Through 1942 and into 1943, the Eastern Front developed characteristics unlike any other theater of operations. The front was immense, stretching over distances that made conventional military logistics nearly impossible. Typical German divisions found themselves responsible for frontages that would have required multiple divisions to hold adequately in Western European terrain. The Leibstandarte, designated as a shock unit, found itself pulled from defensive positions to reinforce critical points when Soviet offensives threatened breakthrough. This constant movement prevented the establishment of prepared defenses and meant that the unit fought successive engagements in exhausted condition. Casualties in shock operations were catastrophic. Soviet tactics emphasized human wave assaults that absorbed casualties at rates that seemed impossible to sustain. The Leibstandarte and other German formations responded with concentrated firepower delivered from prepared positions, but eventually, even prepared positions fell before numbers that seemed inexhaustible. The psychological impact of fighting against seemingly unlimited enemy reinforcements created a form of combat fatigue that was slow-acting but ultimately corrosive. The supply situation deteriorated steadily through this period. Germany's economy, despite massive rearmament, could not sustain the consumption rates required by vast armies operating across continental distances. The Leibstandarte's equipment, which had been superior to Soviet equipment in 1941, gradually became less distinguished. Vehicles broke down and could not be repaired because spare parts were unavailable. Small arms ammunition was rationed. Artillery shells became precious, and their use was restricted except in the most critical circumstances. Fuel for vehicles and heating for men became scarce. The unit began to rely increasingly on captured Soviet equipment, which created its own problems: different caliber ammunition, different maintenance requirements, different operating procedures. Officers had to track which weapons in which positions could use which ammunition. The logistical puzzle became nearly insoluble. Men began to go hungry in periods when supply convoys failed to arrive. The German military, despite its reputation for efficiency, found itself unable to sustain operations across the distances involved. Individual replacements arrived throughout 1942 and 1943, but they never fully compensated for losses. A new soldier, arriving at a Leibstandarte unit, would find himself among men who had survived 18 months or more of continuous combat. These veterans possessed knowledge that could not be taught in training: how to recognize the sound of incoming artillery, how to move across open ground in combat, how to suppress panic in the presence of overwhelming enemy firepower. The veterans also possessed something that resembled contempt for the newer men. The replacements seemed so fragile, so naive, so unaware of what was coming. Many new men did not survive their first engagements. This created a brutal form of selection in which only those who possessed particular combinations of luck, awareness, and psychological resilience survived. The replacements who made it through their first weeks gradually became absorbed into the unit's culture. They adopted the mannerisms of the veterans, learned the passwords and jokes, understood the unwritten rules that governed behavior. The Leibstandarte's identity became self-perpetuating, reproducing itself through the crucible of combat. By 1943, the cumulative effect of extended warfare in Russia had transformed Leibstandarte's character. The unit was no longer the politically motivated protection force that Hitler had created in the 1920s. It was a professional military formation, hardened by years of combat and shaped by the specific demands of warfare in Russia. Its men were no longer the enthusiastic party members who had participated in the 1934 purge. They were soldiers who had learned to kill efficiently and to endure conditions that would have seemed impossible before the war. The ideology remained present, embedded in structures and propagated through leadership, but it had become something different. Where once it had been the justification for military organization, it had evolved into something more like the mythology that binds soldiers of all nations, a shared narrative that gave meaning to sacrifice and coherence to shared trauma. The Leibstandarte's men told themselves they were fighting for civilization against Bolshevism. They told themselves that their sacrifices had purpose. They told themselves that Germany would ultimately prevail. These narratives were sustained with decreasing conviction as losses mounted and victories failed to materialize. The winter of 1942 and 1943 brought another climactic test of endurance. The catastrophe at Stalingrad, fought by other German armies to the southeast, had shocked the German military and political leadership. The Leibstandarte, though not directly involved in the Stalingrad disaster, was positioned in a sector where Soviet offensives threatened equal catastrophe. The unit had to conduct fighting retreats across frozen terrain, had to maintain unit cohesion while falling back, had to prevent encirclement while operating with inadequate reserves. Casualties continued to mount. Frostbite combined with combat wounds to produce horrific injuries that medical personnel struggled to address. Supply shortages reached critical levels. The unit's divisions were rotated back toward Germany for reconstitution, pulled from the front for periods of rebuilding and rearmament. These rotations were brief and never fully restored units to fighting strength, but they provided at least a temporary respite from the grinding attrition of the front lines. By the spring of 1943, the Leibstandarte was being reconstituted and reorganized into a larger formation. The devastating losses of the Eastern Front, combined with the demands of maintaining Hitler's presence throughout German-controlled Europe, necessitated expansion. The unit, that had numbered roughly 2,000 men in 1933, was transformed into a division-strength formation, with 13,000 or more personnel. This expansion required recruitment on a massive scale, and meant that the original cadre of Leibstandarte men became increasingly diluted by new members. The veterans held key leadership positions and attempted to transmit their accumulated knowledge to newer men, but the sheer scale of expansion made this difficult. The Leibstandarte was becoming less a cohesive unit, bound by shared political commitment, and more a conventional military division. Its primary distinction now was its direct relationship to Hitler and its placement in elite formations, given critical assignments. The combat record it had established in Russia had earned it prestige throughout the German military hierarchy, where once it had been viewed with suspicion by the Wehrmacht as a political instrument, it was now recognized as one of Germany's most effective fighting formations. The cost of this recognition was measured in the bodies of 45,000 or more men who had been killed, wounded, or captured across the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1943. These losses were absorbed, mourned briefly, and then replaced by new men arriving from Germany and occupied territories. The machinery of war continued, indifferent to individual cost. In the summer of 1943, the German Wehrmacht prepared for what it believed would be a decisive blow against the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front had settled into a grinding stalemate after the catastrophic winter of 1942, when the Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad. What remained of German strength in the East was concentrated into a desperate gamble, a massive armored offensive codenamed Operation Citadel, or Unternehmen Kursk. At its heart lay the Kursk salient, a vast bulge in the front lines jutting into German-held territory. Intelligence reports suggested the salient could be cut off, encircled, and destroyed if German armor could strike from north and south simultaneously. The Leibstandarte, now transformed into a division of unprecedented firepower, was assigned to the southern thrust. What was meant to be a final German victory would become something far different, a turning point that neither side fully recognized in the moment, but which history would remember as the beginning of the end. The planning for Kursk stretched across months. German commanders understood that the Soviets would defend ferociously, and they assembled what they believed was an unstoppable array of tanks and assault guns. The Leibstandarte received the newest weapons available to German industry, the Tiger tank, with its formidable 88mm gun, the Panzer, faster and more versatile, and the fearsome Ferdinand tank destroyer, a heavily armored vehicle designed specifically to break Soviet armor formations. These machines represented the apex of German technological achievement in 1943. The division was reinforced to unprecedented strength, with troops drawn from across occupied Europe, including volunteer formations from France, Belgium, and Scandinavia. Ideological indoctrination reached fever pitch, as officers and men were told this offensive would crush Soviet resistance and secure German dominion in the East. Yet beneath the confident speeches and the gleaming new tanks lay a troubling reality that few dared voice aloud. The Soviets were expecting them. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning with remarkable effectiveness. Spies in Switzerland and agents within the Nazi state itself provided Moscow with precise information about German intentions, timing, and force dispositions. Far from being caught by surprise, the Soviets had months to prepare their response. They constructed defenses of staggering complexity, multiple lines of trenches, anti-tank gun positions, minefields laid with calculated precision, and reserves positioned to exploit German breakthroughs. The Soviet High Command assembled over 1.9 million soldiers in the salient, distributed across multiple fronts and armies. Artillery pieces were positioned in overwhelming density, some concentrated at levels that Soviet commanders called Kutuzov concentrations, named after the Napoleonic general who had defeated Napoleon through attritional defense. The Soviets had also begun producing tanks in vast numbers. T-34 tanks, Soviet self-propelled guns, and heavy armor. What the Germans viewed as an opportunity for decisive breakthrough, the Soviets saw as a known threat to be met with systematic, methodical destruction. The offensive began on the 5th of July 1943, in sweltering heat. The Leibstandartes component of the Southern Thrust, commanded as part of Army Group South, encountered Soviet defenses almost immediately. Waves of German armor rolled forward, but the Soviet anti-tank gunners were ready, their positioning so dense that German tanks could barely advance 2 or 3 kilometers before encountering fresh obstacles. The Leibstandartes tankers, many of them veterans of years of warfare, understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. The Soviets were no longer the panicked, disorganized force of the early invasion years. They fought with discipline, patience, and a clear understanding of how to use terrain and concentrated firepower to bleed attackers dry. German tanks found themselves channeled into killing zones, their superior armor protection meaningless against the coordinated fire of multiple Soviet anti-tank guns. The division's initial assault waves suffered casualties that would have been catastrophic in any earlier campaign, yet they pressed forward, grinding ahead meter by meter at an unsustainable cost. As the offensive continued through the middle and latter days of July, the battle evolved into something new, a clash between technological systems and operational doctrines. The German tanks, individually superior to Soviet armor, found themselves engaged at ranges and angles that negated their advantages. Soviet tankers, trained to fight in formations and withdraw when outgunned, kept their forces intact, even as individual vehicles fell victim to German guns. The Leibstandarte committed its reserves piecemeal, attempting to sustain momentum, but each advance was met by Soviet counterattacks from fresh formations, held back specifically for this purpose. The landscape around Kursk became a graveyard of metal, burned-out tanks of both sides, their crews entombed within, smoking wreckage scattered across wheat fields under a relentless summer sun. German soldiers, trained from their earliest days in the Hitler Youth to believe in inevitable victory, found themselves questioning that certainty as they watched their squadrons diminish and their objectives remained tantalizingly distant. Supply lines became stretched, ammunition ran low, and fuel consumption for the heavy new tanks exceeded expectations, creating logistical crises that no amount of ideology could resolve. By the third week of July, the scope of the disaster became evident to German commanders. The northern thrust toward Kursk had stalled even more dramatically than the southern drive. Soviet armor reserves were being fed into the battle at precise moments to prevent any breakthrough, a coordinated defense that contrasted sharply with German attempts at centralized control. The Leibstandarte, originally planned to advance perhaps 100 kilometers in the opening phase of the offensive, had managed barely 80 kilometers after nearly 3 weeks of savage fighting. More critically, the promised encirclement of Soviet forces was never going to occur. The Soviets held reserves sufficiently in depth that they could trade space for time, absorbing the German assault without ever allowing themselves to be trapped. German commanders recognized the failure, but were locked into a pattern of committing ever more resources in hopes of achieving breakthrough that would justify the casualties already incurred. This pattern of escalation without purpose became the tragic hallmark of the later stages of the Eastern War. The tank engagements during Kursk produced some of the most intense armored fighting of the entire war. Leibstandarte tankers recorded encounters where they faced Soviet formations outnumbering them by factors of 5 or even 10 to 1. Individual Tiger tanks, operated by crews of exceptional skill, could destroy multiple Soviet tanks before being overwhelmed or running out of ammunition. These moments of local success only deepened the tragedy because the tactical victories could not be translated into operational advantage. A German platoon might destroy 10 Soviet tanks and remain in possession of a small village, but behind that village were more Soviet forces, more anti-tank guns, and more soldiers ready to die to prevent German breakthrough. The mathematics of the Eastern War had shifted in a way that German planners had not fully grasped. Soviet losses in tanks and men were often higher than German losses in the same engagement, yet the Soviets could absorb those losses and continue fighting because they had the manpower and production capacity to sustain such attrition. Germany, despite its technological advantages and fighting prowess, could not. Every tank lost at Kursk was a tank that could not be replaced. Every experienced tanker killed was a tanker whose accumulated knowledge was lost forever. The Leibstandarte's experience at Kursk personified this brutal arithmetic. The division committed units repeatedly throughout the battle, suffering casualties that approached the levels of Stalingrad, yet advancing against an enemy that bent but refused to break. The unit's internal organization began to fray under the strain. Replacement troops arrived from rear areas, often undertrained and lacking the institutional knowledge of the veterans they were replacing. Officers found themselves managing increasing chaos. As supply chains failed, communications networks became saturated with conflicting orders, and the relentless pressure of continuous combat ground away at the coherence of military units. Casualties among officers were particularly severe, as the Leibstandarte's aggressive tactics and leadership by example meant that officers were present in the killing zones where Soviet fire concentrated. The loss of experienced officers meant that tactical control became more difficult, which led to less efficient use of remaining resources, which meant more casualties to achieve less. This downward spiral had become the invisible engine of German defeat. As July turned toward August, the political situation intruded upon the military reality. Germany's Italian allies had collapsed into internal division and impending surrender. The Western allies, despite failing to achieve rapid breakthrough in Normandy, maintained their foothold and continued pouring men and materials into France. For the first time since the invasion of Poland in 1939, Germany faced the prospect of genuine two-front warfare, no longer a theoretical concern, but an emerging reality. German High Command, recognizing that Kursk was failing and that resources were urgently needed elsewhere, began planning to disengage and pull forces westward. The Leibstandarte found itself ordered to cease offensive operations and prepare for withdrawal, even as the Soviets launched their own offensives, designed to expand beyond the original salient. What had begun as a German attempt to seize the initiative on the Eastern Front ended with Germany surrendering it permanently. The final days of German operations around Kursk involved rearguard actions and tactical withdrawals that inflicted additional casualties without achieving any strategic purpose. The Leibstandarte, like other German units, found itself fighting to extricate itself from positions it had barely managed to establish and could not defend. Soviet offensive operations pushed forward relentlessly, and German commanders made the calculation that holding static positions was suicidal. Yet extracting forces in good order required skilled coordination and resources that were increasingly scarce. The retreat from Kursk began a pattern that would characterize the remainder of the Eastern War. German forces in continuous withdrawal, Soviet forces in continuous pursuit, and the territorial changes wrought by tank battles and assault operations, increasingly favoring Soviet recovery of their own soil. The psychological impact on Leibstandart soldiers was profound. They had been assured that this offensive would restore German dominance, that the new weapons represented overwhelming superiority, that Soviet forces were on the verge of collapse. Instead, they had encountered the opposite, an enemy that appeared to grow stronger despite ferocious German assaults, weapons that proved less revolutionary than promised, and objectives that receded even as they were reached. The strategic significance of Kursk extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. For Soviet leadership, the successful defense and subsequent offensive operations demonstrated that their forces had achieved tactical and operational maturity. They had outthought their German opponents, prepared systematically for the assault, executed complex defensive operations flawlessly, and maintained reserves that allowed them to exploit German commitment of resources. For Germany, Kursk represented the end of any possibility for strategic victory in the East. All subsequent German operations would be defensive in character, focused on slowing Soviet advances rather than achieving conquest. The Leibstandarte, which had entered the Eastern War as an elite striking force meant to spearhead German victory, was now locked into a grinding defensive struggle against an enemy that would never again allow German forces the operational initiative. The division would continue fighting with courage and tactical skill, but those qualities could not overcome the fundamental shift in strategic momentum that Kursk had precipitated. The broader implication of Kursk extended to the entire Nazi state and its ideology. German victory had been sold to the German people and to Allied and occupied nations as inevitable, a consequence of superior racial qualities, superior ideology, and superior military organization. The failure at Kursk cracked that edifice, revealing that beneath the confidence and the propaganda lay a regime confronting an enemy it could not defeat. While the general population and even lower-ranking soldiers might not understand the strategic implications, the High Command could not avoid recognizing what had occurred. Resources would have to be managed differently. Manpower would have to be stretched to cover multiple fronts. Sacrifice would increase without corresponding advances. The language used by military and political leadership subtly shifted from discussing victories and conquests to discussing resistance and defense, from speaking of the inevitable triumph of the German people to speaking of holding until new weapons could be developed, or until political pressure could force negotiated settlement. None of these outcomes came to pass, but the shift in discourse reflected the shift in reality that Kursk had imposed. The Leibstandarte withdrew from Kursk, diminished, but not destroyed. It would continue to function as a combat division for nearly 2 more years, participating in battles across the Eastern Front, and later being committed to operations in Italy and France. The men who survived Kursk carried with them the knowledge that their enemy would not be defeated by tactical brilliance or superior technology. The Soviets could absorb losses and continue fighting, could replace equipment and continue fighting, could lose territory and continue fighting with undiminished determination. This understanding would shape the division's conduct in subsequent operations, producing sometimes acts of exceptional brutality born from desperation and fear that the enemy would never quit. The optimism that had characterized much of the Leibstandarte's earlier campaigns faded into grim determination to continue fighting, even as hope faded. Kursk had not destroyed the Leibstandarte, but it had transformed it from an instrument of German conquest into a soldier's monument to the inadequacy of courage and technology when confronted with an enemy willing to endure unlimited sacrifice to prevent defeat. That transformation was visible in the eyes of every veteran who survived to witness what came next. By 1943, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had become something it was never originally designed to be. What began as Hitler's personal bodyguard had evolved into one of Germany's most formidable combat divisions, blooded across thousands of kilometers of Russian steppes. Yet, that very success had become a trap. The Soviet Union demanded constant reinforcement, constant sacrifice, and constant commitment. At Kursk in July, the Leibstandarte had thrown itself against Soviet defenses with characteristic ferocity, only to discover that German armor, however superior in design, could no longer guarantee breakthrough. The failure to achieve decisive victory in Russia created a crisis that would ripple across the entire German war machine. High Command faced a terrible choice: continue bleeding resources into an endless Eastern war, or accept that the real threat now came from the West, where American and British forces gathered strength for an invasion that seemed inevitable. It was in this context of strategic desperation that elements of the Leibstandarte received orders to withdraw from Russia. The decision was made in Berlin with cold calculation. The division, or at least the core of it, would be pulled from the frozen steppes and redirected south. Italy had become a problem that demanded immediate attention. Mussolini's fascist regime had collapsed in July 1943, and the Italians, once Germany's primary ally in the south, had begun secret negotiations with the Western powers. German forces in Italy faced the prospect of fighting not only the advancing Americans and British, but potentially Italian troops as well. The Leibstandarte, with its proven record of aggression and its ability to achieve results through shock tactics, was deemed essential to stabilizing the Italian front and preventing a complete unraveling of German positions in the Mediterranean theater. The journey south from Russia was itself a transition between two entirely different wars. Soldiers of the Leibstandarte traveled by train through the autumn of 1943, watching the landscape shift from devastated Soviet territory to the relative normalcy of Central Europe. They passed through Hungary, through Austria, and finally descended into the mountains of northern Italy. What they found there was neither the triumphant advance they had known in 1940, nor the brutal grinding warfare of Russia. Italy presented a third kind of conflict: mountainous terrain that negated the advantage of mobile, armor-heavy tactics. The peninsula's narrow roads, steep slopes, and established defensive lines meant that the lightning warfare the Leibstandarte had perfected would prove far less effective. The unit would instead find itself engaged in a form of combat closer to attrition and positioning than to breakthrough and exploitation. The Leibstandarte's role in Italy was primarily defensive and reactive. Units arrived in stages throughout the autumn and winter of 1943, attaching themselves to various corps and armies, struggling to maintain German control over an increasingly hostile peninsula. The Italian collapse had created a vacuum, and German commanders rushed to fill it. The Leibstandarte, with its strength and discipline, became a reserve force, deployed to critical sectors where the front threatened to crumble. At Salerno, where American forces had landed in a complex amphibious assault, German counterattacks nearly pushed the beachhead back into the sea. Elements of the Leibstandarte participated in these desperate operations, fighting house to house in Italian villages and contesting every ridgeline. The ferocity was familiar, but the results were different. American forces, well supplied and reinforced, held their ground and eventually pushed inland. Throughout the winter of 1943 and into 1944, the Leibstandarte engaged in defensive operations across the Italian campaign. The unit fought at Monte Cassino in the spring, where German forces attempted to prevent Allied breakthrough toward Rome. The monastery perched on the hilltop became a symbol of German resistance, and the battles to defend and destroy it revealed the grim reality of modern warfare. The Leibstandarte, like every German unit in Italy, faced not a disorganized enemy, but a methodical, grinding opponent with superior numbers, better supplies, and seemingly unlimited reinforcements. Casualties mounted steadily. Replacements arrived from Germany, from other theaters, and increasingly from occupied territories. The ideological cohesion that had once bound the Leibstandarte together began to fray under the pressure of endless attrition. Veterans grew weary. Replacements lacked the training and experience of earlier formations. The division that had swept through France in 1940 seemed like a relic of a different era. By spring 1944, however, strategic reality forced a new calculation in Berlin. Intelligence reports brought increasingly alarming news from France. Reconnaissance confirmed that the Western powers were preparing an invasion. The concentration of troops, the accumulation of supplies, and the steady build-up of invasion craft all pointed toward an imminent operation on the northern coast of France. German High Command faced its starkest choice of the war. Should it continue pouring resources into Italy, where the front had stabilized but offered no prospect of offensive success, or should it concentrate forces in France to meet the anticipated invasion? The decision was essentially predetermined by geography and strategy. An invasion of France threatened the very heart of German-occupied Europe. An invasion of France could potentially be defeated if sufficient force could be concentrated in time. Italy, by contrast, was a sideshow, a hemorrhage that could be slowed but not stopped. The Leibstandarte received orders to withdraw from Italy and relocate to northern France. This decision, made in 1944, represented a dramatic shift in how the division would be employed. Rather than remaining a frontline combat unit engaged in constant operations, the Leibstandarte would be positioned as a strategic reserve, a hammer to be wielded against the anticipated invasion beachhead. The transfer began in spring 1944 as units moved northward through Italy, crossed into southern France, and then proceeded to assembly areas in Normandy and the surrounding regions. The journey itself took weeks. German transportation systems, already strained by Allied bombing, struggled to move entire divisions across the continent. Delays were common. Some units arrived incomplete or undersupplied. The steady deterioration of German logistics, which would become catastrophic by war's end, was already visible in 1944. The arrival of the Leibstandarte in France marked a return to the homeland, but it was a homeland transformed by nearly 5 years of war. The unit had left France in 1940 as part of a victorious army marching through a defeated nation. It returned in 1944 to defend French soil from invasion, to prepare defenses, and to ready itself for the battle that everyone knew was coming. The region of Normandy, where much of the Leibstandarte eventually positioned itself, had been fortified since 1942. Concrete bunkers, minefields, beach obstacles, and defensive lines had been constructed throughout the coastal areas. The German commander in France, Field Marshal Rommel, had ordered an intensification of these preparations in 1944. He believed, correctly, that the invasion would come soon, and that German forces must be positioned close enough to the beaches to counterattack immediately if the Allies achieved a landing. For the Leibstandarte, 1944 became a period of preparation and waiting. Training exercises were conducted, though fuel shortages limited their scope. Replacements arrived constantly, drawn from garrison troops, other divisions, and wounded men returning from hospitals. The division attempted to maintain its cohesion and fighting spirit, even as its composition shifted. Veterans of the Eastern Front found themselves mixed with younger soldiers who had never been in sustained combat. The ideological fervor that had once burned bright in the SS had become routine, institutionalized, divorced from the genuine belief that had motivated men in earlier years. The war had become simply a job, the ideology, a framework that no longer inspired or transformed. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and readiness in an army that everyone at every level understood was fighting a losing battle. The strategic situation that would unfold when the invasion came was already implicit in the positions the Leibstandarte now occupied. The division would be held in reserve during the initial landings, unable to reinforce the beach defenders immediately due to distances and the necessity of confirming that the main invasion had begun. This delay, hours, sometimes a full day or more, would prove fatal to German defensive hopes. When the Leibstandarte finally received orders to move toward the beachhead on the 6th of June, 1944, it would find the path clogged with other units, the roads subject to constant air attack, and the beachhead itself far more firmly established than German commanders had anticipated. The division that had once moved with terrible speed across open terrain would spend the next 2 months moving at a crawl through the hedgerows and villages of Normandy, unable to concentrate its strength and unable to achieve the breakthrough that might have altered the campaign's outcome. The months spent in Italy and France in 1943 and 1944 represented a transitional period for the Leibstandarte. The division was no longer the shock force it had been, no longer the instrument of German offensive ambition. It was becoming instead a battered formation, attempting to maintain coherence as the machinery of German warfare ground toward collapse. The losses in Russia had been tremendous, the burden of reinforcement immense, and the psychological toll of a war that no longer seemed winnable was evident in every report and every personnel file. By the time the Leibstandarte took its positions in France to face the invasion, it retained the name and the history of an elite unit, but much of what had made it truly elite, the absolute conviction in victory, the reserves of trained manpower, the superiority of German military technique, had been consumed in the endless demands of the Eastern Front. What remained was courage, discipline, and the stubborn refusal to surrender, qualities that would carry the Leibstandarte through the desperate struggles to come, but which could not change the fundamental trajectory of the war. The division would fight on, as it always had, with characteristic ferocity and commitment, but it would fight now on territory it could not hold, and for a cause that could no longer be won. In the grey dawn of the 6th of June 1944, the world shifted beneath the feet of men who believed themselves invincible. On the beaches of Normandy, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, no longer a bodyguard unit, no longer a ceremonial presence at party rallies, but a battle-hardened division, blooded across thousands of kilometers of Soviet soil, received orders that would define the final phase of its existence. The invasion they had long anticipated had come, and the men of the Leibstandarte would be hurled into a crucible unlike anything the war had yet offered them. Not the vast maneuver warfare of the Russian steppes, where space and depth offered opportunities for decisive counterattack, but the grinding, claustrophobic horror of the Norman bocage, where every field was a fortress, and every hedgerow concealed enemy guns. The division that had known only victory for more than a decade would now confront an enemy in overwhelming strength, supplied from across the Atlantic, and would discover that even their fanaticism and training could not bend history backward. The Leibstandarte's strength on the morning of the invasion stood at approximately 20,000 combat personnel, distributed across the German-occupied territories. The division was not concentrated in Normandy. Units were scattered across France, some resting near Paris, others stationed further south, all of them far enough from the coast that mobilization would consume precious hours. This fragmentation reflected the fundamental miscalculation of German command. Despite weeks of tension and numerous warnings, the High Command remained convinced that any major invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where German defenses were thickest and where Hitler had positioned his best reserves. The deception campaign, orchestrated by Allied planners, had worked with almost complete success. When reports arrived on that 6th of June morning that landings were occurring in Normandy, many German officers initially dismissed the news as a feint, a diversion, preceding the true assault that would come elsewhere. In this confusion and delay lay the first failure of German response, and the first opportunity lost for the Leibstandarte to contest the beachhead, while Allied forces remained vulnerable. The division's initial deployment was hasty and fragmented, reflecting the chaos of reacting to an invasion from a dispersed posture. Elements began moving toward the coast immediately, but the process was neither coordinated